Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a huge shout out to Tyler for suggesting this topic. The Hanging Gardens conspiracy is exactly the kind of deep mystery that keeps us up at night, and I think you're going to love where this investigation takes us. Now let's talk about something that shouldn't exist but does, or rather, something that should exist but doesn't. Among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, only one has never been found. Not a trace, not a foundation stone, not a single confirmed artifact. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are described in vivid detail by ancient historians, poets who wrote of impossible greenery cascading down terraced stone, of waterfalls flowing upward through desert heat, of trees from distant lands thriving where nothing should grow. Yet after centuries of excavation, the site remains a ghost. Archaeologists have turned over every stone in ancient Babylon searching for evidence of this legendary marvel, and the silence is deafening. The question isn't just where the gardens were. The question is how they could have existed at all. How did ancient engineers irrigate forests rising hundreds of feet into the air without the machinery we rely on today? The answer may be far stranger than anyone imagined, and it changes everything we thought we knew about the technological capabilities of the ancient world. Picture yourself standing in the dusty excavation sites outside modern-day Hilla, Iraq, where ancient Babylon once dominated the Mesopotamian plain. The sun beats down mercilessly, the same sun that baked this land 3,000 years ago. Archaeologists work carefully through layers of earth, each shovelful potentially containing fragments of one of history's greatest civilizations. They find pottery shards, cuneiform tablets, the foundations of temples and palaces. But of the Hanging Gardens, supposedly the most spectacular structure ever built in this city, they find nothing. It's as if the most famous landmark of ancient Babylon simply never existed. Yet the descriptions are too consistent, too detailed to dismiss as pure fantasy. Greek and Roman historians writing centuries apart describe the same impossible structure. Terraced gardens rising in massive stone tiers, each level thick with soil supporting full-grown trees. Waterfalls cascading from level to level. The scent of flowers mixing with the acrid smell of the desert. And everywhere, the impossible sight of lush vegetation thriving where nothing should grow, sustained by water that appeared to flow upward against gravity itself. The ancient writers struggled to explain what they were seeing. They used words like magic, divine intervention, the work of gods. But they also tried to provide mechanical explanations, descriptions of chain pumps and water screws that might account for the irrigation. These explanations satisfied historians for centuries. They fit within our understanding of what ancient technology could accomplish. Simple machines, human labour, clever engineering working within the constraints of Bronze Age capabilities. But what if the ancient writers were describing something they genuinely didn't understand? What if they were trying to explain advanced technology using the only vocabulary available to them? When you read their accounts with fresh eyes, something else emerges. A pattern of details that don't quite fit the standard explanation. References to constant moisture in the air even during drought seasons. Descriptions of the gardens glowing at night with a peculiar luminescence. Mentions of strange sounds, humming or resonating tones that seem to come from the structure itself. Reports that metal objects near the gardens would sometimes spark or create small shocks. These details get dismissed as embellishment, the mythologizing that happens when stories are passed down through generations. But what if they're not embellishments? What if they're accurate observations of phenomena the ancient writers couldn't explain? The clues were always there, hidden in plain sight within the classical texts. We just weren't looking for them. We assumed ancient peoples were primitive, that advanced technology is a modern invention, that our linear progression from simple to complex is how human development must work. The Hanging Gardens are about to force us to reconsider everything we think we know about the ancient world. Because beneath the sand of Mesopotamia, something is waiting. Something that suggests our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we ever imagined. And something that powerful people in the modern world seem very interested in keeping secret. Before we get into the story, quick reminder, If you're enjoying sleep theories, it would mean the world if you could leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps more people find these deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community. Someone commented last week that they were listening from a research station in Antarctica at 3 in the morning, which is absolutely wild. Alright, let's get into it. Previous chapters 1 to 6 remain exactly as provided in the document. Chapter 7. The Hidden Blueprint. The breakthrough came in December of 2019, 3 months into the excavation of the Nineveh site. Workers clearing debris from the lowest chamber, the one containing the base of the central shaft, found a sealed alcove built into the wall. The seal was intact, undisturbed for millennia, marked with cuneiform symbols that translated roughly as, "For those who come after, should wisdom guide their hands." Inside the alcove was a basalt tablet, polished smooth and covered in intricate carvings. The preservation was remarkable. Where other clay tablets had crumbled or suffered water damage over the centuries, this stone tablet remained pristine, as if it had been sealed away just yesterday rather than 27 centuries ago. Dr. Vasquez photographed the tablet in place before removing it, documenting every detail. The cuneiform inscriptions covered both sides of the tablet, dense with text and interspersed with technical diagrams of stunning complexity. This wasn't the simple pictographic writing of early Sumerian civilization. This was advanced technical documentation, the kind of detailed schematic you might find in a modern engineering manual. The tablet was transported to a climate-controlled facility in Baghdad, where specialists in ancient Mesopotamian languages could begin the painstaking work of translation. Dr. Sarah Winters, the researcher who had identified the earlier technical tablet in the British Museum, flew in from London to assist. She brought with her detailed photographs and translations of that earlier document. Suspecting the two tablets might be related, she was right. The Nineveh tablet was a companion document, more detailed and comprehensive than the fragment in the British Museum. Where the earlier tablet had shown basic schematics, this one provided complete construction specifications, materials lists, precise measurements, step-by-step assembly instructions, and most remarkably, theoretical explanations of how and why the technology worked. The translation took weeks. The technical terminology was unlike anything in standard cuneiform dictionaries. Many concepts had no direct equivalent in modern language, requiring careful interpretation based on context and the physical evidence from the excavated chambers. But slowly, impossibly, a coherent picture emerged. The tablet described the construction of what it called a heaven-earth resonator, a device designed to capture and channel natural electromagnetic forces. The text explained that the Earth itself generates electrical potential through the interaction of its molten core with the magnetic field. Lightning demonstrates this power during storms, but the potential exists constantly, waiting to be harnessed. The vertical shaft served as an antenna, extending deep into the Earth to tap into geomagnetic currents, while simultaneously reaching toward the sky to capture atmospheric electricity. The copper coils wound around the shaft created an electromagnetic inductor, amplifying the natural currents into usable power. The crystalline arrays positioned throughout the chambers acted as piezoelectric transducers, converting mechanical vibrations from seismic activity and temperature fluctuations into additional electrical charge. But the most remarkable section of the tablet dealt with what it called water summoning. The text explained that water vapour exists invisibly in all air, even in the driest deserts. The particles of water are too small and dispersed to see, but they can be influenced by powerful forces. Just as a lodestone attracts iron, electromagnetic fields of sufficient strength can attract and concentrate water molecules. The tablet provided detailed calculations for the field strength required to induce condensation from atmospheric moisture. It described the optimal geometric arrangement of the coils to create focused zones of high electromagnetic intensity. It explained how temperature differentials enhanced the effect, causing water vapour to transition rapidly from gas to liquid state. The gardens weren't irrigated by pumped water. They were irrigated by electromagnetically induced precipitation, artificial rain created through manipulation of atmospheric moisture. The terrace structure described in classical sources would have positioned plants within the zones of maximum electromagnetic effect, places where water would literally materialize from the air in a constant gentle mist. But the tablet went further. It described additional effects of the electromagnetic fields, enhanced plant growth through stimulation of cellular processes, pest control through electromagnetic frequencies that disrupted insect nervous systems, even psychological effects on humans, with specific frequencies inducing states of calm, focus, or spiritual awe depending on the configuration. The gardens weren't just a marvel of irrigation. They were a complete environmental control system, creating an artificial microclimate through electromagnetic manipulation of natural forces. And according to the tablet, they were just one application of the technology. The same principles could be adapted for weather control, communication across vast distances, even medical treatment through electromagnetic therapy. Dr. Winters sat back from her translation work, rubbing tired eyes. "This isn't ancient superstition or religious mysticism," she said to Vasquez. "This is applied physics, sophisticated, practical, tested engineering based on deep understanding of natural forces." "Who wrote this?" Vasquez asked. "The tablet is from Sennacherib's era, but the knowledge it describes is far more advanced." Winters pointed to a passage near the beginning of the tablet. It says here, "Copied from the teachings of the Apkallu, preserved in the library of Eridu, first city of the world, built before the deluge when the gods walked among men." The Assyrians weren't inventing this technology. They were copying it from sources that were already ancient to them. Eridu was the oldest known city in Mesopotamia, occupied as early as 5000 before the Common Era. If the tablet was accurate, technical knowledge of electromagnetic engineering existed in some form over 4,000 years, before Sennacherib, over 4,500 years before the present day. That pushed the origins of the technology back into what archaeologists considered the Stone Age, a period when humans supposedly possessed only the most primitive tools. But what if that periodization was wrong? What if advanced civilization existed far earlier than conventional history acknowledged? The flood myth spoke of a lost world, a golden age destroyed by catastrophe. Archaeological sites around the world showed evidence of sophisticated knowledge that seemed out of place for their time period. Perhaps these weren't anomalies. Perhaps they were remnants of a forgotten age when humanity had achieved technological sophistication we're only now rediscovering. The tablet contained one final section that chilled everyone who read it. A warning, written in stark, unambiguous language. "Let those who seek this knowledge be warned. The power to summon water from air can also banish water from earth. The forces that bring life can bring death. The antediluvian kings wielded this power without wisdom. They turned the Resonators to war, seeking to destroy their enemies by stealing rain from their lands, by sending storms to flood their cities. They created weapons that shook the earth and split the sky. And in their hubris, they destroyed themselves. The deluge that ended the First Age was no act of gods, but the consequence of forces unleashed beyond control. We who survived seal this knowledge in stone and earth, that it may serve future generations if they prove wiser than we were. But if wisdom is lacking, let it remain hidden, for the price of misuse is not merely death, but the ending of ages." Dr. Vasquez read the warning 3 times, each time feeling a deeper sense of unease. The tablet was describing a technological catastrophe, a civilization that developed powerful electromagnetic technology, weaponized it, and triggered some kind of environmental collapse that resulted in the Great Flood remembered in myth across multiple cultures. If that interpretation was correct, the implications were staggering. It meant humanity had reached high levels of technological development before, had nearly destroyed itself, had been set back to primitive conditions and spent thousands of years climbing back toward what was lost. It meant our current civilization wasn't the first, might not be unique, might be following a pattern that had played out before, and it meant the knowledge they had uncovered was genuinely dangerous, not just theoretically, but practically, historically proven to be capable of causing civilization-level catastrophe if misused. "We need to be extremely careful about how we publish this," Winters said quietly. Vasquez nodded, but she was thinking about something else. The tablet had been deliberately sealed in a hidden alcove marked with a warning about wisdom. Someone in the ancient world had tried very hard to preserve this knowledge, while also restricting access to it. They wanted future generations to be able to find it, but only if those future generations were responsible enough to use it properly. The question was whether modern civilization met that criteria, and based on what was about to happen, the answer appeared to be no. Chapter 8. Why the technology, vanished understanding. How the electromagnetic gardens worked was one thing. Understanding why they disappeared was another puzzle entirely, one that would prove far more disturbing. Dr. Vasquez and her team spent the early months of 2020 analysing the Nineveh tablet and comparing it to the physical evidence from both excavation sites. Dr. Chen, the MIT physicist, worked with engineers to create computer models of the system based on the ancient specifications. The models confirmed what the tablet claimed. The technology would work exactly as described. But the models also revealed something troubling. The electromagnetic fields generated by the system at full power would be enormous, far stronger than anything in nature except lightning strikes. And unlike lightning, which dissipates in microseconds, these fields would be sustained continuously for as long as the system operated. Chen ran simulations of the environmental effects. The immediate area around the gardens would experience dramatically altered conditions. Atmospheric humidity would spike, air ionization would increase dramatically, the local magnetic field would be distorted, and these effects wouldn't stay local. Electromagnetic fields propagate. They spread outward, diminishing with distance but still measurable hundreds of miles away. Multiple installations operating simultaneously would create interference patterns. The fields would interact, reinforcing in some locations, cancelling in others. Weather patterns would shift as atmospheric moisture was redistributed. Animal migrations would be disrupted as species dependent on magnetic field navigation lost their way. And there were concerning implications for human health, particularly long-term exposure to strong electromagnetic fields. "This isn't just garden technology," Chen explained to a meeting of the research team. "This is geoengineering, climate manipulation. If multiple sites across Mesopotamia were operating these systems, they could have altered weather patterns across the entire region, maybe beyond." Dr. Winters had been researching historical climate data for ancient Mesopotamia. She found something remarkable. Around 600 before the Common Era, roughly the time period when Nebuchadnezzar's gardens would have been operational, there was a significant wet period in the archaeological record. Increased flooding, higher water tables, more extensive agriculture. Then, abruptly around 500 before the Common Era, the climate shifted. Drought, decreased rainfall, environmental stress. What if the climate improvement wasn't natural, Winters suggested? What if it was artificially created by the electromagnetic installations? And when those installations were shut down, the climate reverted to its normal arid state. The implications were staggering. If true, it meant ancient Mesopotamian civilization had become dependent on artificial climate control. When that technology was lost or deliberately shut down, the environmental consequences would have been severe. Crop failures, water shortages, the kind of environmental stress that could trigger the collapse of civilizations. But why would the technology be deliberately shut down? The tablet provided part of the answer with its warnings about weapons and catastrophe. But Vasquez suspected there was more to the story, information that hadn't made it into the surviving records. She found the clue in a seemingly unrelated source, a fragment of a Greek text written by Ctesias, a Greek physician who worked at the Persian court in the 5th century before the Common Era. Ctesias wrote about Babylon during the Persian period, after its conquest by Cyrus. Most of his work was lost, surviving only in quotations by later authors, but one passage had always puzzled historians. "The gardens of Babylon stood abandoned in my time, the waters no longer flowing, the trees withered and dead. The Persian Magi examined the foundations and declared the place cursed, the devices below ground to be sealed forever by order of the King of Kings. They said the ancient builders had offended the gods by presuming to control forces meant for heaven alone. Conventional interpretation assumed this was religious prohibition, Persian priests objecting to Babylonian technology on spiritual grounds. But read in light of the electromagnetic installations, it took on new meaning. The Persian Magi were priests, yes, but they were also the inheritors of ancient Mesopotamian knowledge traditions. They would have understood what the underground devices actually were and what they could do, and they ordered them sealed, not destroyed, but sealed, deliberately buried and forbidden. Dr. Vasquez found more evidence in cuneiform texts from the Persian period. Administrative documents from Babylon contained references to large quantities of stone and earth being moved to the palace district, construction projects that seemed to be filling in excavations rather than creating new buildings, orders from Persian authorities to prevent anyone from digging in certain areas. The Persians were systematically burying the electromagnetic installations, cutting them off from atmospheric contact, filling in the vertical shafts, sealing the chambers, and they were doing it deliberately as official policy. They knew what they had found, Vasquez realized. They knew it was dangerous, and they decided it needed to stay buried. But the Persians hadn't worked alone. Further research revealed similar patterns at other sites. Nineveh had been partially destroyed by the Medes and Babylonians in 612 before the Common Era. But after the conquest, there was an unusual construction period. Not rebuilding the city, but filling in underground chambers, sealing tunnels. The conquerors weren't just destroying Nineveh. They were making sure whatever was beneath it stayed beneath it. A pattern emerged every time one of these electromagnetic installations was discovered by later civilizations. It was deliberately sealed again. Not merely left to decay, but actively buried. Someone, across multiple cultures and time periods, was working to keep this technology hidden. Dr. Chen suggested a disturbing possibility. What if there's an organization, a tradition spanning thousands of years, specifically dedicated to suppressing this knowledge? Secret societies are usually dismissed as conspiracy theory, but ancient priesthoods genuinely did preserve secret knowledge. What if some of them had the specific mission of preventing electromagnetic technology from being rediscovered? It sounded paranoid, but the evidence supported it. The Persian Magi sealing the Babylon site, the priesthoods of various Mesopotamian temples that had access to ancient texts but never revealed their contents, the mystery schools of ancient Greece and Egypt that claimed to preserve secret wisdom from antediluvian times, and if such a tradition existed in the ancient world, was it possible it survived into the modern era? That there were still people, still organizations, who knew about ancient electromagnetic technology and worked to keep it suppressed? The team was about to find out the answer was yes, and those people were about to take a very direct interest in the excavations at Babylon and Nineveh. Chapter 9. Suppressed publication. Dr. Vasquez prepared her findings for publication in the spring of 2020. The paper was comprehensive, meticulously documented, and utterly revolutionary. It detailed the electromagnetic installations found beneath Babylon and Nineveh, included translations of the technical tablets, presented evidence that ancient Mesopotamian civilization possessed advanced knowledge of physics and engineering, and argued for a complete reassessment of human technological development. She submitted it to 3 of the most prestigious peer-reviewed archaeology journals, the Journal of Archaeological Science, Antiquity, and the American Journal of Archaeology. All 3 journals had published her work before. She had a solid reputation, decades of professional publications, and impeccable credentials. The paper should have at least gone to external review, even if editors were skeptical of the conclusions. Instead, all 3 journals rejected it without review. The rejection letters were nearly identical, professionally polite but firm. The findings were too anomalous, too far outside conventional historical understanding. The interpretation of the copper-lined chambers as electromagnetic devices was unsupported speculation. The translations of the tablets were questioned despite being performed by recognized experts in cuneiform languages. The paper represented fringe archaeology, not serious scholarship. Vasquez was shocked, but not entirely surprised. Revolutionary findings always faced resistance. She revised the paper, focused more on the physical evidence and less on theoretical interpretation, and resubmitted. This time she included detailed reports from Dr. Chen and other physicists, confirming that the discovered structures were consistent with electromagnetic systems. The second round of rejections came faster. No explanation, just form letters declining publication. Then her funding situation changed. The grant supporting her research in Iraq was scheduled for renewal in June of 2020. The renewal should have been automatic. Her work was rated as highly productive by the review committees. She was producing significant archaeological discoveries. There was no reasonable justification for denying renewal. The renewal was denied. No explanation given beyond vague references to shifting research priorities and budgetary constraints. Appeals were rejected. Without funding, Vasquez couldn't maintain her team in Iraq. The excavations had to be suspended. The Iraqi Department of Antiquities, which had been cooperative if cautious up to this point, suddenly revoked her excavation permits entirely. The stated reason was that the sites needed to be secured and protected pending further study by Iraqi authorities. Iraqi authorities who immediately restricted all access to the Babylon and Nineveh sites. Workers were brought in to fill in the excavated chambers, not to protect them, but to rebury them. Within weeks, the underground installations that had been exposed to light for the first time in millennia were sealed again beneath tons of earth. Vasquez tried to protest, tried to contact colleagues in Iraq, tried to appeal through academic channels. She found herself facing a wall of silence. Former collaborators stopped returning calls. University administrators who had supported her work suddenly became unavailable. Her emails went unanswered. Then the government interest began. In July of 2020, Vasquez received a visit at her home in California from two men in dark suits who identified themselves as representatives from the Department of Defense, specifically from an agency called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. They were polite, professional, and very interested in her research. They asked detailed questions about the electromagnetic installations. They wanted to know about the coil configurations, the crystalline arrays, the power generation systems. They were particularly interested in the atmospheric water generation effects. Could the technology be scaled up? Could it be made portable? What were the military applications? Vasquez refused to speculate on military applications. She emphasized that her work was purely archaeological, focused on understanding ancient civilizations, not on developing new weapons. The men nodded politely and left. But the message was clear. The United States military was very interested in what she had found. Over the following months, Vasquez received similar visits from representatives of other nations, a team from China, ostensibly from a university, but asking questions that suggested military intelligence background. Scientists representing Russian archaeological institutes who were far more interested in technical specifications than in historical context. Even representatives from private corporations, technology companies and defense contractors offering substantial sums for consulting work. Everyone wanted access to the ancient electromagnetic technology, and everyone was being told no by someone with more power than Vasquez possessed. The artifacts from the excavation, including the precious basalt tablet with its technical diagrams, were moved to a secure facility in Baghdad. Vasquez was told they were being preserved for future study. When she requested access to continue analysis, she was denied. The artifacts were classified as Iraqi national treasures, access restricted to authorized personnel only. Vasquez's Iraqi contacts told her the truth off the record. The artifacts weren't in Baghdad at all. They had been crated and shipped out of Iraq entirely. Where they went, no one would say, but the smart money was on the United States. Specifically, to a military research facility where they could be studied without public scrutiny. The basalt tablet, the ancient instruction manual for building electromagnetic installations, had disappeared into classified research programs. The technology the ancient world had tried so hard to seal away was now in the hands of modern military and intelligence agencies. and they weren't planning to publish their findings in academic journals. But Vasquez had been careful. She had made copies of everything. Photographs of the artifacts, scans of the tablets, detailed documentation of the excavations. She had shared this data with trusted colleagues around the world, insurance against exactly this kind of suppression. She couldn't publish through traditional academic channels, but in the age of the internet there were alternatives. She prepared a comprehensive report, included all her documentation, and uploaded it to independent research platforms, preprint servers, and alternative media sites. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, the report had been viewed tens of thousands of times. Researchers around the world downloaded the data and began their own analysis. The findings couldn't be suppressed completely because they were already out in the open. But something else happened. A coordinated campaign to discredit the research. Articles appeared in mainstream media describing Vasquez as a crackpot, a fringe archaeologist making wild claims about ancient aliens and lost civilizations. Never mind that she had never mentioned aliens. Never mind that her research was based on physical evidence and legitimate scholarship. The narrative was being controlled. Someone with substantial resources and media influence was working to ensure that if the research couldn't be suppressed, it could at least be discredited. Pushed to the fringes where serious scholars wouldn't engage with it, where the public would dismiss it as conspiracy theory, rather than legitimate archaeology. And it was working. Despite the evidence, despite the documentation, despite the testimony of multiple credentialed experts, the mainstream academic and scientific establishment closed ranks. The Babylon discoveries were deemed too extraordinary to be believed. The electromagnetic interpretation was rejected as fantasy, and anyone who took the research seriously risked their own professional reputation. Dr. Chen, the MIT physicist, found himself facing career consequences for supporting Vasquez's interpretations. Funding for his research was questioned. His department chair suggested he distance himself from the Babylon project if he wanted to maintain his position. The message was clear. This was a career-ending line of inquiry, but not everyone backed. Down. Researchers around the world began re-examining ancient sites with new eyes, looking for evidence of similar electromagnetic installations, and they were finding it. Underground chambers beneath temples in Egypt, unexplained metallic structures at sites in South America, geometric patterns that looked suspiciously like antenna arrays carved into stone monuments worldwide. The evidence was accumulating. Ancient civilizations really had possessed sophisticated technology. The electromagnetic installations weren't unique to Mesopotamia. They were global, and someone across multiple cultures and time periods had worked systematically to hide them. The question was whether modern civilization would prove wiser than the ancients, whether we would use this rediscovered knowledge responsibly, or whether we would repeat the mistakes that led to catastrophe before. Based on what was happening behind classified doors in research facilities around the world, the answer wasn't encouraging. Chapter 10. The Modern Replication Attempt. While Dr. Vasquez fought to get her research acknowledged by mainstream academia, someone else was taking a more direct approach. A private research facility in Nevada, funded by a group of anonymous investors interested in alternative energy technology, had obtained copies of her documentation, and they decided to test whether the ancient system could actually function as described. The facility was located in a remote area north of Las Vegas, far from prying eyes and curious neighbours. The team they assembled included electrical engineers, materials scientists, and theoretical physicists. None of them cared about academic politics or career risks. They wanted to know if the technology worked. They started small, a scaled-down version of the Babylon system, built according to the specifications in the ancient tablets. A vertical shaft only 15 feet deep rather than over 100. Copper coils wound with precise spacing, a lower chamber filled with electrolytic solution matching the chemical composition found in the Babylon excavation. Crystalline arrays positioned according to the geometric patterns described in the documentation. The total cost was substantial, well over $1 million in materials and construction. But the investors had deep pockets and were willing to fund the experiment. By September of 2020, the apparatus was complete and ready for testing. Initially, nothing happened. The system sat inert, just elaborate metalwork and coloured liquid. The engineers tried various configurations, different alignments, adjustments to the coil spacing. Weeks passed without results. The project seemed destined to prove that the ancient technology was purely symbolic, that any resemblance to functional electromagnetic systems was coincidental. Then a research assistant named Jennifer Park noticed something unusual. During thunderstorms, electromagnetic field detectors around the apparatus showed increased activity. Not just random noise from the lightning, but structured patterns that seemed to synchronize with the storm's electrical discharges. The copper coils were responding to the atmospheric electricity, acting as antennas picking up electromagnetic radiation from the lightning. On impulse, Park suggested installing a lightning rod directly connected to the central shaft. If the system was designed to capture atmospheric electricity, it needed a direct pathway for that energy to enter. The next major thunderstorm wasn't scheduled for weeks, but Las Vegas occasionally experienced isolated electrical storms in the fall. They would wait and see what happened. The storm arrived on October the 7th, 2020. As lightning flashed across the desert sky, the research team monitored their equipment. Multiple cameras recorded from different angles. Electromagnetic sensors logged field strength. Temperature and humidity monitors tracked environmental conditions. When lightning struck the rod, everything changed. The electromagnetic field around the apparatus spiked dramatically, not just from the lightning itself, which dissipated in milliseconds, but sustained. The copper coils were storing and amplifying the charge exactly as the ancient design intended. The fields weren't uniform. They pulsed in specific patterns, strongest around the coiled sections, creating zones of intense electromagnetic activity. Temperature sensors in those zones registered a sudden drop, several degrees in seconds, far too rapid to be explained by ambient weather changes. And humidity readings spiked. Water was condensing out of the air, pulled from vapor state into liquid droplets by the electromagnetic forces. Within an hour, visible condensation was forming on surfaces near the coils. Not just normal humidity, but steady streams of water appearing seemingly from nowhere, flowing down the copper surfaces like miniature waterfalls. The system was generating water from atmospheric moisture, exactly as the ancient text described. The team placed plants near the apparatus, fast-growing species that would show results quickly. Within days, the effects were obvious. Plants positioned in the zones of high electromagnetic activity showed dramatically accelerated growth. Leaves were larger, greener, more vigorous. Root development was enhanced. The plants were thriving. Dr. Chen flew out to Nevada to observe the functioning system. He brought sophisticated measurement equipment, instruments that could precisely quantify the electromagnetic fields and their effects. The readings confirmed what the visual evidence showed. The ancient technology worked exactly as advertised. This is atmospheric water generation on a scale I didn't think was possible without enormous power inputs, Chen said, studying his instruments. The electromagnetic fields are manipulating water molecules at the quantum level, affecting their phase transitions. It's elegant, efficient, and completely revolutionary for our understanding of what ancient peoples could achieve. But there were troubling aspects to the results. The electromagnetic fields extended far beyond the immediate area of the apparatus. At reduced strength, they were measurable over 100 meters away, and they weren't static. They pulsed, cycled through frequency variations, created interference patterns that spread in expanding waves. Local wildlife began behaving strangely. Birds avoided flying over the facility. Insects, normally abundant in the desert, were absent from the area. Small mammals showed signs of stress when brought near the operating system. The electromagnetic fields were affecting animal nervous systems, disrupting normal behaviours in ways that could be dangerous if scaled up. And there were effects on humans too. Several members of the research team reported headaches when working near the active system, sleep disturbances, difficulty concentrating. Nothing severe, but noticeable. Electromagnetic hypersensitivity was controversial in mainstream medicine, but the team was experiencing something. The team decided to test the system at higher power. They enhanced the lightning rod system, added capacitor banks to store larger charges, and modified the coils to handle increased current. During the next major storm, they let the system operate at what they estimated was 30% of the capacity the full Babylon installation would have possessed. The results were dramatic and unsettling. Water generation increased exponentially, gallons per hour pouring from the atmospheric condensation. The electromagnetic fields became so strong that electronic equipment within 50 meters began malfunctioning. Radio communication was disrupted. The local power grid experienced fluctuations, and the weather changed. Humidity in the area spiked to levels far above normal for the Nevada desert. A local fog developed, thick and unnatural. Within the zone of influence, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Clouds formed directly above the facility despite clear skies everywhere else. They were creating weather, artificial, localized, but unmistakably weather manipulation. The ancient Mesopotamians hadn't just built irrigation systems, they had built climate control devices. The team shut down the system immediately. The implications were too serious to continue without careful consideration. If this technology could alter weather at 30% power, what could the full-scale Babylon installation have done? And what would happen if multiple sites operated simultaneously? Climate manipulation, weather weapons, the ability to cause drought or flood, to steal rain from enemies, to create agricultural abundance in one region while causing famine in another. The ancient warnings about antediluvian weapons suddenly seemed very real and very relevant. The Nevada facility prepared a detailed report of their findings. Before they could decide how to publish it, they received a visit from federal agents, Department of Energy officials accompanied by military representatives. The visitors were polite but firm. The research had national security implications. The apparatus and all documentation needed to be secured under government oversight. The team was given a choice: continue their research under classified conditions with government funding, or cease all work and turn over their findings. Either way, public disclosure was not an option. This technology was too potentially dangerous to be available to just anyone. Most of the team chose to continue under government oversight. The work was too fascinating to abandon. But Jennifer Park, the research assistant who had figured out the lightning rod solution, quit. She copied as much data as she could on her way out the door. She sent that data to Dr. Vasquez, and Vasquez added it to the growing collection of evidence that ancient electromagnetic technology was not only real, but functional. It worked, and modern military and intelligence agencies around the world were racing to develop it as a new generation of weapons and control systems. The technology that had destroyed an ancient civilization was being rebuilt, and despite the warnings carved in tablets 3,000 years ago, modern humanity seemed determined to repeat the mistakes of the past. Epilogue. The civilization. Before civilization. Stand in the ruins of Babylon today and you see only sand and broken stone. Nothing suggests the impossible gardens that once defied nature itself. The Iraqi government has filled in the excavations, buried the copper-lined chambers, sealed the ancient technology back in the earth where it remained hidden for millennia. Official statements claim the sites need protection from looters and environmental damage. The real reason is more complicated and more disturbing, but you can't bury the truth completely, not anymore. The digital age makes information nearly impossible to suppress. Dr. Vasquez's research exists on servers around the world, downloaded thousands of times, discussed in forums and alternative research communities. The Nineveh tablet translations are available online. Photographs of the electromagnetic installations circulate through academic backchannels, shared by researchers who know they can't publish openly, but refuse to pretend they didn't see what they saw. And once you know what to look for, the evidence is everywhere. Ancient sites around the world show signs of electromagnetic technology. Underground chambers lined with conductive materials, crystalline structures positioned in geometric patterns, vertical shafts descending into bedrock for no apparent architectural reason, features that conventional archaeology dismisses as mysterious, but which make perfect sense if you understand what they actually are. The Great Pyramid of Giza with its granite chambers and precise alignments, the Temple of Karnak with its forest of columns creating a massive resonance chamber, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey with its T-shaped pillars and underground installations dated to 10,000 before the Common Era, Puma Punku in Bolivia with its precisely carved stones and megalithic construction. These aren't just religious monuments, they're the remnants of a global technological civilization that existed before recorded history began. Mainstream academia refuses to acknowledge this. The implications are too revolutionary, too threatening to established models of human development. If advanced civilization existed 10,000 years ago or earlier, if it developed sophisticated technology and then collapsed, it means everything we thought we knew about the arc of human progress is wrong. It means technological advancement isn't inevitable or linear. It means civilizations can rise to great heights and fall to oblivion, losing everything they built. It means our modern world is fragile in ways we don't like to admit. And it means the ancient warnings about misusing powerful technology are not myths or superstition, but historical records of actual catastrophe. The flood myths remember what happened. A worldwide disaster that destroyed an advanced civilization. Not divine punishment, but technological catastrophe. Climate manipulation pushed too far. Weather weapons used in war without understanding the consequences. Electromagnetic installations operating at such power and scale that they destabilized atmospheric and geological systems, triggering the collapse that sent humanity back to primitive conditions. The survivors, the legendary Apkallu and their equivalents in other cultures, preserved what knowledge they could. They encoded it in myths and religious traditions. They built monuments aligned with astronomical precision to preserve mathematical and engineering knowledge in stone. They created secret societies and priesthoods to guard the most dangerous technologies, ensuring they would remain hidden until humanity was wise enough to use them responsibly. But they failed. The knowledge is being rediscovered, and we are not proving to be wiser than our ancestors. In research facilities around the world, scientists are rebuilding ancient electromagnetic systems. They're studying atmospheric water generation for commercial applications. They're developing weather manipulation technology for agricultural use. They're exploring electromagnetic frequency weapons that can affect human neurological function from a distance. All applications of the same fundamental technology that destroyed a civilization 10,000 years ago. The warning signs are already visible. Climate instability increasing worldwide, weather patterns becoming more extreme and unpredictable. Some of it is certainly due to conventional industrial activity and greenhouse gas emissions, but how much might be due to classified electromagnetic experimentation? How many government research programs are testing technologies they don't fully understand, pushing boundaries without considering the systemic consequences? We'll probably never know. That information is classified at the highest levels, restricted to people with security clearances far beyond what elected officials possess. Secret programs operating with black budgets, developing technologies the public has no knowledge of, making decisions that affect all of humanity without any democratic oversight or public debate. The ancient Mesopotamian engineers who built the Hanging Gardens tried to control nature. For a time, they succeeded. They created impossible gardens in the desert. They demonstrated that human ingenuity could overcome natural limitations, and then everything collapsed, destroyed by the consequences of technologies they thought they understood but didn't. We're following the same path. We've rediscovered their knowledge, and instead of heeding their warnings, we're racing to implement it, faster than our competitors. Every nation wants the strategic advantage of weather control, of electromagnetic weapons, of technologies that can reshape the environment to human will. No one wants to be left behind while rivals develop capabilities they don't possess. It's an arms race. Just like the antediluvian kings competed with their electromagnetic installations, modern nations compete with classified research programs, and arms races have a long history of ending badly, of creating weapons that ultimately get used, of unleashing consequences that no one intended or predicted. Dr. Elena Vasquez continues her research from her home in California. She's been effectively blacklisted from mainstream archaeology, but she's become a prominent figure in alternative research communities. She gives lectures at independent conferences, publishes on platforms that don't require peer review, and continues to sound the alarm about what she discovered beneath Babylon. The Hanging Gardens weren't destroyed by time or conquest, she says in one of her presentations. They were deliberately dismantled by people who understood they were too dangerous to keep operational. The ancient world made a conscious decision to seal this technology away, and we've made a conscious decision to dig it back up and develop it. I think history will show our decision was a mistake. I just hope we figure that out before we repeat the catastrophe that ended the last technological age. Her warnings are dismissed by mainstream scientists who haven't examined the evidence, who assume ancient peoples couldn't have possessed such knowledge, who trust that modern civilization is fundamentally different from and more advanced than anything that came before. But some researchers listen. Some understand that the archaeological evidence is real, that the technology works, that the warnings carved in ancient tablets are not myths, but urgent messages from people who learned terrible lessons about the consequences of hubris. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are more than a lost wonder. They're a message from our ancestors, a warning that technological power without wisdom leads to disaster, a reminder that civilizations can rise to great heights and fall to nothing, losing everything except fragmented memories preserved in myth. A demonstration that the cycle has happened before and can happen again. We assume we're smarter than ancient peoples, more sophisticated, more advanced. We trust that our science is better, our understanding deeper, our ability to control nature more developed. But the copper-lined chambers beneath Babylon tell a different story. They tell us that people 3,000 years ago, or perhaps 10,000 years ago, or perhaps even earlier, developed technologies we're only now beginning to understand. And they chose to hide those technologies because they had learned, through bitter experience, what happens when such power is misused. The gardens that shouldn't have worked did work. They rose above the desert, green and impossible, sustained by forces that ancient writers could barely describe. They were monuments to human ingenuity, proof that we could master nature itself. And then they vanished, sealed deliberately beneath the earth, hidden so completely that for thousands of years we forgot they existed. Now we've found them again. We've decoded the tablets, analysed the structures, rebuilt the systems. We've confirmed that the ancient technology is real and functional, and we're developing it for modern use, convinced we can control forces that destroyed an earlier civilization. Perhaps we're right. Perhaps modern science and democratic oversight will prevent the catastrophic misuse that ancient warnings describe. Perhaps we really are wiser than our ancestors. But looking at the classified research programs, the military applications, the competition between nations to develop these technologies first, the pattern looks disturbingly familiar. Power without wisdom, capability without responsibility, the rush to implement technologies we don't fully understand because we're afraid of falling behind those who might implement them first. The Hanging Gardens stand as a warning, not just of what we can achieve, but of what we can lose, not just of the heights we can reach, but of how far we can fall. The antediluvian civilization rose to technological sophistication, perhaps even surpassing our own in certain areas, and then it fell, destroyed by the consequences of its own power, leaving behind only ruins and myths and warnings that later generations would dismiss as impossible fantasies. We are not the first technological age, we're just the latest. The question is whether we'll be the last, or whether some future civilization will dig up our ruins and wonder how we vanished, why our great cities fell silent, what catastrophe ended our era just as catastrophe ended the era of those who came before. The answers are waiting in the earth, carved in ancient tablets, preserved in myths and legends that we treat as entertaining stories rather than historical warnings. The Hanging Gardens that shouldn't have worked reveal that our understanding of human history is incomplete, that ancient civilizations achieved far more than we credit them with, and that the technological confidence of our modern age may be as misguided as the confidence of those who built impossible gardens in the desert and believed they had mastered nature itself. The cycle continues, rise and fall, achievement and catastrophe, technological sophistication followed by collapse, unless we learn from the warnings left by those who came before. unless we recognise that the Hanging Gardens are not just an archaeological mystery, but a message from the past, telling us that the path we're walking has been walked before, and it leads to a place we don't want to go. The choice is ours. The technology exists. The knowledge is available. The electromagnetic systems that could reshape our world for better or worse are being developed right now in classified facilities around the globe. What happens next depends on whether we prove wiser than the antediluvian kings, whether we can resist the temptation to weaponize everything we discover, whether we can learn to use power responsibly instead of competitively. The ancient world tried and failed. They left us warnings, hoping future generations would learn from their mistakes. Now we face the same test, and the evidence suggests we're failing it in exactly the same ways they did. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were real. They worked through technology we're only beginning to understand. They were deliberately hidden because they were too dangerous, and now they're being rebuilt by people who think they know better, who believe modern science has surpassed ancient wisdom, who are convinced that this time will be different. History suggests otherwise. The ruins of vanished civilizations suggest otherwise. The warnings carved in stone 3,000 years ago suggest otherwise. The gardens rise again, not in Babylon, but in research facilities in Nevada and elsewhere around the world. The copper coils wind deep into the earth. The electromagnetic fields pulse and grow stronger. Water condenses from empty air, and somewhere, ancient engineers who understood what happens when this power is unleashed without wisdom would be warning us to stop, to seal the installations, to hide the knowledge before it's too late. But we're not listening. We never do. Every civilization believes it's different, smarter, more advanced. Every age thinks it has surpassed what came before, and every empire thinks its fall is impossible, right up until the moment it collapses into dust and is forgotten, leaving behind only ruins for future archaeologists to puzzle over. The Hanging Gardens are not a mystery. They're a warning, and we're ignoring it. There are moments in history when the impossible walks into the ordinary world and changes everything. This is the story of one small American town where that line blurred completely. For 13 months, residents of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, reported encounters with something that defied explanation. A creature with glowing red eyes and wings like an aircraft. A figure that appeared in the darkness and vanished without sound. And then, on a cold December afternoon, tragedy struck. And the sightings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. Was it coincidence? Mass hysteria? Or was something trying to warn a town that wouldn't listen? This is the story of the Mothman, a phenomenon so strange that it has haunted investigators for more than 50 years, a mystery that sits at the intersection of cryptozoology, ufology, and prophecy, a series of events that challenged everything witnesses thought they knew about reality. What you're about to hear is based on documented testimony from more than 100 witnesses, police reports filed in real time, newspaper accounts from the period, the exhaustive investigation conducted by journalist John Keel, who spent over a year in Point Pleasant documenting every detail he could find. This isn't a campfire story embellished for effect. This is what happened when something impossible appeared in a small American town and refused to be ignored. When reality bent just enough for witnesses to see through to something else. When a messenger arrived with a warning that nobody could understand until it was too late. The Ohio River runs through West Virginia like a vein of dark water, separating states and connecting communities. In November of 1966, that river bordered a town that was about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. A town where something with wings and burning eyes would appear night after night, creating a pattern of fear and strangeness that would end only when tragedy claimed 46 lives, in a single catastrophic moment. This is Point Pleasant. This is the Mothman, and this is what happened when the impossible refused to stay hidden. Chapter 1. The First Encounter. The night of November 15, 1966 was unseasonably warm for late autumn in West Virginia. The temperature had climbed into the mid-60s during the day, and even after sunset the air remained mild. Two young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, and Steve and Mary Mallett, were driving near an abandoned World War II munitions plant just outside Point Pleasant. The area, known locally as the TNT area, had been closed since the end of the war, its network of concrete bunkers and storage igloos left to decay among the overgrown fields. They were looking for friends, driving the quiet back roads that wound through the old industrial site. Roger was at the wheel of his car, a Chevrolet that he kept in good condition. Linda sat beside him in the passenger seat. Steve and Mary were in the back talking quietly about their plans for the coming week. It was meant to be an ordinary night, a casual drive through familiar territory, nothing more. But as Roger guided the car past one of the massive concrete domes that dotted the landscape, Linda saw something that made her grip the dashboard hard enough that her knuckles went white. Near the entrance to an old power plant, two enormous red lights hovered in the darkness. At first, she thought they might be reflections, maybe tail lights from another vehicle, or some trick of the moon. But these lights weren't reflecting anything. They had depth. They had presence. They glowed with their own internal illumination, steady and unwavering in the night air. And they were eyes. Roger slowed the car instinctively, his foot easing off the accelerator as he tried to process what he was seeing. The lights didn't move. They remained fixed in position, roughly 6 feet off the ground, separated by a distance that suggested they belonged to something large, something that was watching them. Then the shape around those eyes became visible, a figure standing upright in the shadows near the power plant entrance, taller than any man Roger had ever seen, at least 6.5 feet, maybe 7. Its body was grey and muscular, humanoid in basic structure but wrong in every proportion. The torso was too thick, the limbs were too long, and there was no visible neck. The head seemed to sit directly on the shoulders, creating a silhouette that violated every expectation of how a standing figure should look. Steve leaned forward from the back seat, his voice barely a whisper. "What is that?" Nobody answered. They were all staring at the same impossible thing. The creature shifted its weight, and that simple movement revealed something even more disturbing. From its back rose wings, massive appendages that had been folded against its frame, but were now becoming visible in the dim light. They weren't feathered like a bird's wings. They had a leathery quality like the wings of a bat, but impossibly large. Even folded, they created a cape-like silhouette that made the creature look even more imposing. For a moment, that felt like an hour nobody moved. The creature stood perfectly still, its red eyes fixed on the car. Roger's hand remained frozen on the steering wheel. Linda's breath came in short, shallow gasps. In the back seat, Mary had gone completely silent, her hand clutching Steve's arm with enough force to leave marks. Then the creature moved. Its wings unfolded with a sound like heavy canvas snapping in wind. The span was enormous. Roger would later estimate 10 feet, though in the moment it seemed to fill his entire field of vision. The wings spread wide, and then the creature simply lifted off the ground. There was no running start, no awkward flapping as it gained altitude. It rose vertically into the air with smooth, deliberate power, its wings beating with slow, purposeful strokes. Roger didn't make a conscious decision to drive away. His body took over, his foot slamming down on the accelerator before his brain fully processed what it had seen. The tyres spun on the gravel road, kicking up stones that rattled against the undercarriage. The car lurched forward, engine roaring as Roger pushed it faster than was safe on these narrow roads. But the thing followed. It stayed just behind them at first, wings beating steadily as it matched their speed with what seemed like minimal effort. Then it moved to the side, paralleling the car as they raced down the winding road. Roger could see it in his peripheral vision, a massive shape keeping pace, those red eyes glowing steadily in the darkness. Linda was screaming now, her voice high and terrified. Mary had her hands over her face, unable to look. Steve was turned in his seat, watching the creature through the rear window, his face pale in the dashboard light. Roger pushed the car faster, 50 miles per hour, 60. The speedometer climbed to 70 on a road where 40 was dangerously fast. The car's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and abandoned structures that blurred past. But the creature kept pace. It didn't struggle. It didn't fall behind. It simply flew alongside them as if their desperate speed was nothing more than a leisurely pace. They passed through a section of road bordered by thick woods on both sides. Roger prayed the creature would lose sight of them, that the trees would provide some kind of barrier. But when they emerged into open fields, it was still there, still following, still watching with those burning red eyes. The chase continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, as they approached the main highway and the lights of Point Pleasant became visible ahead, the creature made a final move. It rose higher into the air, gaining altitude with a few powerful wing beats. It circled once above the car, a massive silhouette against the stars, and then it simply vanished. Not flew away into the distance, not disappeared behind trees or buildings. It was there one moment, wings spread, eyes glowing, and gone the next, as if it had never existed at all. Roger didn't slow down until they were well into town, surrounded by streetlights and traffic and the blessed normalcy of civilization. He pulled into the parking lot of the Mason County Courthouse, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn off the ignition. They sat in silence for a long moment, all four of them breathing hard, trying to convince themselves that what they'd just experienced had actually happened. Finally Steve spoke. "We need to tell someone." Deputy Millard Halstead was on duty that night, working the evening shift at the courthouse. He'd been a law enforcement officer for over a decade, and he'd heard his share of strange reports. But when the four young people walked into his office just after midnight, he could see immediately that something had genuinely terrified them. Roger Scarberry's hands were still trembling. Linda's face was tear-streaked and pale. Steve kept running his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he seemed unable to control. Mary hadn't said a word since they'd arrived, just sat in the chair Halstead offered her and stared at the floor. They were scared. Not drunk, not high, not pulling a prank. They were genuinely, profoundly frightened by something they'd seen. Halstead took their report with the seriousness it deserved. He knew these people. Roger worked construction jobs around town. He was a solid, reliable guy who showed up on time and did good work. Steve Millett was employed at a local plant, married, starting a family. These weren't troublemakers or attention seekers looking to cause a stir. These were ordinary people who had encountered something extraordinary. He took detailed notes as they described what they'd seen, the location near the old power plant at the TNT area. The creature's appearance, humanoid but wrong, with massive wings and glowing red eyes. The way it had moved, lifting straight up into the air, matching their car's speed effortlessly, disappearing without flying away. When they finished their account, Halstead made a decision that would prove significant. He drove out to the TNT area himself that night, taking another deputy with him. They brought high-powered flashlights and searched the area around the power plant where the creature had first been seen. They found nothing. No creature, no footprints, no physical evidence of anything unusual. The old power plant stood silent and abandoned, its windows broken and its machinery long since removed. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. But Halstead filed an official report nonetheless. He documented the sighting with precise detail, noting the time, the location, the description provided by all four witnesses, and his own search of the area. He treated it as he would any legitimate incident, because as far as he could tell, it was legitimate. These people had seen something. They couldn't all be mistaken. They couldn't all be lying. The report went into the official record. A creature with wings and glowing red eyes. Something that could fly at 70 miles per hour. Something that watched from the darkness at the edge of town. By sunrise, the story had spread through Point Pleasant like wildfire. People talked about it at breakfast diners and coffee shops. They discussed it at work and in passing on the street. The reactions were mixed. Some people dismissed it as nonsense, but many others listened with interest and concern. Point Pleasant was a small town. When 4 residents reported something this strange, people paid attention. Within 48 hours, a reporter from the local newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register, had interviewed the witnesses and written an article. The headline read, "Couple see man-sized bird, creature, something." The article treated the report seriously, noting that the witnesses were credible and that law enforcement had taken the matter seriously enough to investigate. The story was picked up by regional papers, then by wire services. Within a week, Point Pleasant was receiving attention from newspapers across the country. The creature needed a name, and a reporter at the Ohio newspaper came up with one inspired by a Batman villain that had recently appeared on television, Mothman. The name stuck, and the sightings were just beginning. Chapter 2. The TNT Area. To understand why Point Pleasant became the centre of this phenomenon, you have to understand the TNT area. The location wasn't just an abandoned industrial site. It was a sprawling complex with a dark history that stretched back to America's involvement in World War II. In 1942, as the United States mobilized for war, the federal government identified a need for massive increases in explosive production. They chose a site just outside Point Pleasant, West Virginia, for a new facility that would manufacture TNT on an unprecedented scale. The location was ideal, close to the Ohio River for shipping, near rail lines for transport, and remote enough that accidents wouldn't threaten major population centres. Construction began immediately. The West Virginia Ordnance Works, as it was officially known, covered several thousand acres of former farmland and forest. The facility included manufacturing buildings, storage bunkers, administrative offices, worker housing, and an extensive network of roads connecting all the components. The storage bunkers, called igloos because of their distinctive dome shape, were engineering marvels designed to contain explosive materials safely. Each igloo was a massive concrete structure, partially buried in artificial hillsides with reinforced doors and ventilation systems designed to prevent accidental detonation. At peak operation, the facility contained hundreds of these storage units, each one capable of holding tons of high explosives. Thousands of people worked at the ordnance facility during the war. They manufactured TNT, processed chemical compounds, loaded munitions, and maintained the complex machinery required for industrial-scale explosive production. The work was dangerous. There were accidents, chemical burns, explosions, injuries from heavy machinery. But the facility operated around the clock, producing the material that would fuel the Allied war effort. When the war ended, the facility was decommissioned. The manufacturing equipment was removed or dismantled. The workers dispersed. The administrative buildings were emptied. But the igloos remained, too massive and too expensive to demolish. They were simply sealed and abandoned. By the 1960s, the TNT area had become a strange landscape of industrial ruins. The concrete igloos dotted the fields like ancient burial mounds. The roads had cracked and been reclaimed by weeds. The administrative buildings had been vandalised, their windows broken, and their interiors stripped of anything valuable. The entire site was officially restricted. No trespassing signs were posted, and occasionally police would patrol. But it was impossible to truly secure thousands of acres of empty land. Local teenagers used the area for parties. Hunters knew the deer were plentiful in the abandoned fields. Couples sometimes drove the back roads for privacy. Everyone in Point Pleasant knew the TNT area, and despite the official restrictions, many people had been there at one time or another. But the area had always had a reputation for strangeness. Even before the Mothman sightings began, people reported unusual experiences there. Lights moving between the igloos at night, not flashlights or vehicle headlights, but unexplained illumination that seemed to float through the air. Strange humming, or vibrating sounds that seemed to come from underground, as if machinery was still operating in sealed spaces below the surface. The feeling of being watched when walking through the ruins, even when no one else was visible. Some of this could be explained. The bunkers were connected by underground tunnels. Some people claimed there was an entire network of passages beneath the surface, though this was never officially confirmed. Animals made dens in the abandoned structures. The wind created odd acoustics when it moved through broken buildings and concrete passages. But the reputation persisted. The TNT area was a place where things felt wrong. After the Scarberry Mallet sighting, investigators began examining why so many encounters with the Mothman occurred at or near this location. The bunkers provided shelter. If the creature was physical, it could hide in the sealed igloos or the underground tunnels. The remote location offered privacy. The creature could move through the area without constant human observation. The proximity to the Ohio River provided access to water and potentially to a wider range of territory if the creature could fly. But some researchers suggested more exotic explanations. The ground at the TNT area was contaminated with chemicals from wartime production. Decades of TNT manufacturing had left residues in the soil and groundwater, compounds that could affect both human perception and potentially attract or enable unusual phenomena. Some theorists pointed to reports of radioactive materials having been stored at the facility during the war, though documentation of this was scarce. Others noted the electromagnetic properties of the location. The Ohio River Valley was known for unusual lightning activity. The limestone geology of the region could create piezoelectric effects under stress. The presence of underground water and metal infrastructure might create electromagnetic anomalies. If the Mothman phenomenon was somehow related to unusual energy fields or dimensional boundaries, the TNT area might provide ideal conditions. John Keel, who had arrived to investigate a few weeks after the first sighting, noted that the TNT area functioned almost like a stage set. The massive concrete structures provided dramatic backdrop. The open fields between igloos offered clear sight lines for witnesses. The darkness between structures created pockets of shadow where something could appear and disappear. It was, he observed, almost perfectly designed for a phenomenon that wanted to be seen but not captured or examined closely. The igloos themselves were deeply unsettling even in full daylight. They rose from the hillsides like ancient temples, their concrete surfaces weathered and stained. The steel doors were massive, designed to contain explosive force, and many had rusted partially open or been torn away entirely. Inside, Darkness stretched back into artificial caves that smelled of decay, dampness and lingering chemicals. Some igloos had collapsed partially, their concrete shells cracked open to reveal the rebar reinforcement within. Others remained intact but ominous, their interiors invisible from the outside. At night, the TNT area became something else entirely. The lack of artificial light meant true darkness, the kind that city dwellers rarely experience. The stars were visible in stunning clarity, but they only made the ground-level shadows deeper. The concrete igloos became indistinct shapes in the blackness. The trees along the access roads rustled with movements that could be wind or animals, or something else entirely. And after November 15, 1966, dozens of people would report seeing the Mothman in this landscape, standing atop the igloos with wings spread, crouched near the entrances to the underground bunkers, moving between structures with fluid, inhuman grace. Always watching, always visible just long enough to be seen clearly, always vanishing before anyone could get close enough to verify what they were actually looking at. The creature had found its territory, or perhaps the territory had called to the creature. Either way, the TNT area and the Mothman would become forever linked in the public imagination, a place where reality bent and something impossible made itself known. Chapter 3. Sightings multiply. Within days of the first report making the newspapers, more witnesses came forward. Not just young couples driving at night, but residents from all walks of life who had seen something they couldn't explain. Some had encountered the creature before the Scarberry Mallet sighting, but had been too frightened or embarrassed to report it. Others were having experiences in the aftermath, as if the creature was becoming more active or more visible. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across different witnesses who had no contact with each other. Height consistently estimated between 6 and 7 feet when the figure stood upright. Colouring described as grey or brownish grey, sometimes with a slightly metallic sheen in certain light. Muscular build with clearly defined limbs, but proportions that were distinctly non-human. The torso was described as thick and powerful. The arms were long. Witnesses noted that when the creature stood with arms at its sides, the hands hung past where human hands would reach. But the most consistent elements were the wings and the eyes. The wings were universally described as massive. Conservative estimates put the wingspan at 10 feet, though some witnesses insisted they were larger. When folded, they created a cape-like silhouette down the creature's back. When extended, they blocked out significant portions of sky or background structures. Witnesses struggled to describe the texture. Some said leathery like a bat, others said more like folded fabric. Still others couldn't categorize it at all beyond not feathers. And the eyes, every witness mentioned the eyes. They were large, much larger than human eyes, and positioned in what seemed like a standard facial arrangement, though many witnesses noted that they couldn't see other facial features clearly. The eyes glowed red, not reflected light the way animal eyes shine when caught in headlights. These eyes produced their own illumination, glowing with internal light that remained constant regardless of external lighting conditions. The psychological effect of those eyes was profound. Multiple witnesses described feeling hypnotized or frozen when the creature looked directly at them. Several people reported that the eyes seemed to convey intelligence, not animal cunning, but actual awareness and thought. One witness said the eyes felt ancient and knowing. Another described them as looking through me, not at me. The encounters followed geographical and temporal patterns that would become significant to later analysis. The creature appeared most frequently in the TNT area, but sightings extended across a wider region. It was spotted along the Ohio River waterfront, near the Point Pleasant power plant, in residential neighborhoods on the outskirts of town, along Route 62 heading north, at intersections where power lines crossed the road. Temporarily, sightings clustered in the evening and nighttime hours, between dusk and midnight most commonly, though there were reports from as late as 3 or 4 in the morning. But there were also several daylight encounters, which complicated theories that the creature was purely nocturnal, or that witnesses were mistaking known animals in darkness. The behaviour patterns were equally consistent and equally strange. The creature didn't attack. Despite dozens of close encounters over the coming months, no one was ever physically harmed by the Mothman. It didn't approach people aggressively. It didn't make threatening gestures. It simply appeared and watched. Sometimes it would follow cars as it had followed the Scarberries and mallets. These pursuit incidents were particularly terrifying for those who experienced them. The creature would pace vehicles at high speeds, 60, 70 miles per hour, apparently without effort. Witnesses described its flight as smooth and effortless, with slow wing beats that seemed insufficient for the speed it maintained. Some pursuers reported that the creature would fly alongside the car close enough that they could see details of its form. Others said it stayed behind the vehicle, visible in the rearview mirror, its eyes glowing steadily in the darkness. Other times the creature would be spotted stationary, standing on a rooftop, perched on a power line, positioned atop one of the TNT igloos. In these encounters it would remain motionless for extended periods, sometimes several minutes, giving witnesses ample time to observe. Then it would depart, sometimes flying away with visible wing beats, other times simply ceasing to be there. Multiple witnesses described this. Instantaneous disappearance. The creature would be clearly visible one moment and completely gone the next, with no transition period and no visible departure. The sounds associated with the creature were minimal and inconsistent. Some witnesses reported no sound at all. The creature flew silently, its wing beats producing no audible noise. Others described a faint rustling or whooshing sound when the wings moved. A few reported hearing a high-pitched shriek or squeak, though this was less common and might have been from other sources. No witness ever reported the creature making human-like vocalizations or attempting to communicate through sound. Physical evidence was frustratingly absent. No footprints were found, despite searches of areas where the creature had been seen standing. No feathers or fragments were recovered. No photographs captured clear images. Cameras of the era required good lighting and steady subjects, and the Mothman appeared in darkness and moved unpredictably. Several people attempted photographs, but the results were either too dark to show detail or too blurry to be useful. On November the 17th, just 2 days after the Scarberry Mallet encounter, a volunteer firefighter named Harold Stanton reported seeing the creature in his backyard. He was letting his dog out just before midnight when the animal began barking frantically at something near the tree line. Stanton stepped outside with a flashlight and swept the beam across his property. The light caught red eyes 20 feet away. The creature was standing upright near a large oak tree, wings folded against its back. For several seconds, Stanton and the creature stared at each other. Then the Mothman unfolded its wings. Stanton would later say they extended to at least 12 feet, and lifted straight up into the air. It cleared the tree line and disappeared into the night sky. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but Stanton was shaken enough that he called the sheriff's department to report it. On November 24, a young woman named Connie Carpenter had an encounter that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was driving home from her parents' house, taking a route that passed near the TNT area. It was around 9 in the evening, fully dark, and the road was empty of other traffic. As she rounded a curve, something large and grey dropped from the sky and landed on the road directly ahead of her car. She slammed on the brakes, her tyres squealing as the vehicle shuddered to a stop. The creature stood in her headlight beams, facing her. Its wings were spread partially, creating a shape that filled the width of the narrow road. Its eyes reflected her headlights with that distinctive red glow. Carpenter sat frozen, her hands locked on the steering wheel, unable to move. The creature took several steps toward her car. She would later describe its gait as awkward but powerful, like something that wasn't designed for walking but could do so when necessary. It approached within 10 feet of her front bumper. Then it simply stepped aside, moved to the shoulder of the road, and with several powerful wing beats launched itself back into the air. Carpenter sat in her stopped car for several more minutes, crying and shaking, before she could compose herself enough to drive home. These were just a few of the encounters during those first weeks. The Point Pleasant Register was documenting as many reports as possible, and Mary Heyer, the paper's lead reporter on the story, was quickly becoming overwhelmed by the volume of accounts. People called her office constantly. Some wanted to report sightings, others wanted information about what was happening. Still others were terrified and looking for reassurance that something was being done. The Mason County Sheriff's Department was receiving calls as well. Some were clearly pranks, teenagers calling in false sightings as jokes. But many were legitimate reports from frightened residents who had seen something they couldn't explain. Deputies found themselves driving out to investigate sighting locations multiple times per night, though they never found the creature themselves. The attention from outside media intensified. Reporters from Charleston and Huntington arrived to interview witnesses and tour the TNT area. Television crews came from as far away as Pittsburgh. The Associated Press picked up the story, and suddenly Point Pleasant was national news. A small West Virginia town was being visited by something impossible, and the world was paying attention. The reactions among townspeople varied widely. Some embraced the attention and the uniqueness of the situation. The local business community saw opportunity. Restaurants and motels were filling with visiting reporters and curious tourists. Others were deeply uncomfortable with the spotlight, feeling that their town was being made to look foolish or backward. But the fear was real and widespread. Parents kept children indoors after dark. Schools noticed decreased attendance at evening activities and sporting events. Gun sales increased at local sporting goods stores as people sought protection against an unknown threat. Some residents installed additional outdoor lighting. Others avoided driving alone at night, especially near the TNT area. The creature seemed utterly indifferent to the disruption it was causing. The sightings continued with the same frequency and the same patterns. It appeared, it watched, it vanished. And with each new encounter, the mystery deepened. What was this thing? Where had it come from? What did it want? And most disturbingly, why Point Pleasant? Those questions would attract the attention of a journalist who specialised in exactly these kinds of unexplained phenomena. A man who would spend the next 13 months documenting every detail of the Mothman encounters and developing theories that would challenge conventional understanding of reality itself. His name was John Keel, and his arrival in Point Pleasant would transform the investigation from local mystery to national phenomenon. Chapter 4. John Keel enters the story. John Alver Keel was not a typical paranormal investigator. Born in 1930, he had worked as a journalist, radio scriptwriter, and author specialising in unusual phenomena. By the mid-1960s, he had established himself as one of the more serious researchers in the field of UFOs and unexplained events. Unlike many investigators who approached these topics as true believers or determined debunkers, Keel maintained a position of informed skepticism. He was willing to investigate with an open mind, but he demanded evidence and looked for patterns rather than accepting sensational claims at face value. When Keel heard about the Point Pleasant sightings in December of 1966, his initial interest was professional curiosity. Strange creature reports weren't uncommon, and most could be explained as misidentification, hoaxes, or exaggeration. But something about the Point Pleasant case intrigued him. The number of witnesses was unusually high. The consistency of descriptions across independent reports suggested something more than mass hysteria, and the involvement of law enforcement, who were taking the reports seriously rather than dismissing them, indicated this wasn't a simple prank or media invention. Keel arrived in Point Pleasant in mid-December, expecting to spend perhaps a week gathering information for an article. He checked into a local motel, contacted the newspaper to review their files, and began the methodical process of interviewing witnesses. What he found surprised him. The witnesses were credible. Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Millette. These weren't attention seekers or people prone to making up stories. They were genuinely traumatized by what they had experienced. Keel had interviewed enough false witnesses over the years to recognize the difference between fabrication and authentic experience. These people had seen something that terrified them, and they were still processing the psychological impact. He interviewed Connie Carpenter, who broke down crying as she described the creature blocking the road in front of her car. He spoke with Harold Stanton, the firefighter who had seen it in his backyard. He tracked down other witnesses who hadn't made official reports but had shared their experiences with friends or family. Each interview added detail and consistency to the overall picture. Keel also interviewed the skeptics, people who believed the sightings were misidentifications of known animals or hoaxes. He listened to their arguments carefully. Sandhill cranes, some suggested. Large birds with red patches and impressive wingspans that migrated through the region. But the described wingspan was too large, the flight capabilities too advanced, and Sandhill cranes didn't have glowing eyes or hover in place. Large owls, others proposed. But no owl species reached 7 feet in height or could pace a car at 70 miles per hour. The hoax theory was more difficult to dismiss entirely, but it had significant problems. How would hoaxers create a creature that could fly convincingly? How would they coordinate appearances across multiple locations on the same nights? Why would they target this specific area? And most significantly, why had no one involved in such a hoax come forward to claim credit or been caught in the act? With dozens of sightings over multiple weeks, someone should have slipped up if this was an elaborate prank. Keel spent time at the TNT area, walking through the abandoned bunkers and storage igloos during both day and night. The location was genuinely eerie. He could understand why unusual reports might cluster there, but he found no evidence of hoaxers, no equipment or materials that might be used to create a fake creature, just empty concrete, structures slowly being reclaimed by nature. As he continued his investigation, Keel began documenting phenomena that extended beyond simple creature sightings. Witnesses reported electrical disturbances before or after encounters. Television sets would malfunction, static replacing the picture, or the picture appearing but with severe distortion. Phones would ring with no one on the line, or callers who asked strange questions and disconnected abruptly. Some witnesses described physical sensations after sightings, burning sensations in their eyes that lasted for hours or days, headaches that came on suddenly and severely, feelings of being watched even when alone in their homes. Several people reported nightmares featuring the creature or related imagery, dark wings, glowing eyes, the sensation of flying or falling. Keel himself began experiencing unusual phenomena. His phone at the motel would ring at odd hours, 2 or 3 in the morning, and when he answered, he would hear strange sounds or voices that seemed artificially generated. Sometimes the voice would deliver cryptic messages. You should leave Point Pleasant. Stop asking questions. You cannot understand what is happening. Other times the calls consisted only of electronic tones or static that felt somehow purposeful rather than random. His mail was tampered with. Letters he sent to colleagues took weeks to arrive or never reached their destination. Mail he received was opened and resealed. He noticed his room was being searched when he was out. Nothing stolen, but items moved slightly from their original positions. He began setting small traps. A hair placed across a drawer, a piece of paper positioned carefully on his suitcase. Every time he returned from an interview or research trip, the traps had been disturbed. Keel was an experienced enough investigator to recognize surveillance and intimidation when he experienced them. But who was conducting this operation? Local authorities had no reason to interfere with his investigation. They were cooperative and interested in his findings. Federal agencies seemed unlikely unless there was some classified project he'd stumbled into. But the behaviour of his surveillors felt wrong, too obvious, too theatrical, as if the point was to be noticed rather than to conduct effective clandestine observation. He began keeping meticulous records of everything. He documented each witness interview with detailed notes, recording dates, times, locations, and specific descriptions. He mapped sighting locations on detailed charts of the area, looking for geographical patterns. He tracked the dates and times of all reported encounters, searching for temporal patterns. He maintained a separate log of anomalous phone calls and surveillance incidents. The patterns he discovered were fascinating and disturbing. Sightings clustered around specific dates, particularly around major holidays or periods of community stress. They concentrated geographically near the TNT area, but also appeared along specific roads and near electrical infrastructure. They increased during periods when unusual lights had been reported in the night sky over the Ohio River Valley. Keel also noticed something that would become central to his later theorizing. The creature's behavior didn't match biological patterns. It appeared and disappeared with no regard for physical constraints. It flew in ways that defied aerodynamics. It showed no signs of needing to eat, rest, or maintain a dwelling. It was seen in multiple locations on the same nights at times that would require impossibly rapid travel. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't even a cryptid in the traditional sense. A hidden species living in remote areas and occasionally crossing paths with humans. This was something else entirely. Something that operated according to different rules. Something that seemed to exist partially outside normal physical reality. Keel had investigated UFO cases, where witnesses reported similar qualities, craft that defied physics, entities that appeared and disappeared, experiences that felt more like hallucinations than physical encounters, but left physical evidence behind. He began wondering if the Mothman was related to the broader phenomenon he'd been investigating for years. Not an extraterrestrial visitor, but something that existed in dimensions or states that occasionally intersected with human reality. He expanded his investigation beyond the creature sightings. He interviewed people who reported unusual lights over the Ohio River. He documented strange sounds that several residents reported hearing, low-frequency humming that seemed to come from underground or from the sky. He collected accounts of premonitions and prophetic dreams that had increased in frequency since the sightings began. The more Keel investigated, the stranger the picture became. Point Pleasant wasn't just experiencing creature sightings, it was experiencing a full spectrum of high strangeness, a term Keel used to describe events that defied conventional explanation and seemed to cluster in specific locations during specific time periods. And he began to suspect that the sightings weren't random. They were building toward something. The creature was appearing with increasing frequency. The intensity of encounters was escalating. Witnesses were having more profound psychological and physical reactions. Everything felt like preparation or warning, though for what Keel couldn't yet determine. He decided to stay in Point Pleasant. Not for a week, but for as long as the phenomenon continued. He rented a longer-term accommodation, established relationships with local witnesses and authorities, and committed himself to documenting every aspect of what was happening. What he didn't know was that he was documenting the build-up to tragedy. That in exactly 1 year, the reason for all the strangeness would become horrifyingly clear. That the Mothman wasn't just a mystery to be solved, it was a warning that nobody could interpret until it was too late. Chapter 5. The Men in Black Reports. As the winter of 1966 progressed, and the Mothman sightings continued, another phenomenon emerged that would complicate the investigation and push the events firmly into conspiracy territory. Witnesses began receiving visits from strange men who asked questions about their encounters. These weren't journalists or researchers like Keel. They weren't police officers conducting official investigations. They were something else entirely, something that witnesses struggled to categorize or explain. The first reports came in late December. Mary Heyer, the Point Pleasant Register reporter who was covering the Mothman story extensively, received a visit at her office from 2 men in dark suits. They identified themselves as representatives of a government agency she'd never heard of, showing badges that looked official but featured insignia she couldn't identify. They asked detailed questions about her reporting, which witnesses she'd interviewed, what information she'd gathered, whether she'd discovered any physical evidence of the creature. Heyer found the interaction deeply unsettling. The men's behaviour was formal to the point of robotic. They spoke in stilted, overly precise language. Would you be willing to share information regarding the encounters you have documented, rather than can you tell us about the sightings you've covered? Their facial expressions were fixed and unnatural. They didn't blink with normal frequency. When she offered them water, a basic courtesy in her office, one of the men picked up the glass and stared at it as if he'd never seen such an object before, holding it but never drinking. The visit lasted perhaps 20 minutes, during which the men asked questions that became increasingly bizarre. They wanted to know if she'd experienced any unusual dreams, whether her electrical devices had malfunctioned, if she'd received any strange phone calls. The questions felt less like investigation and more like evaluation, as if they were testing her responses rather than seeking information. When Heyer asked to examine their identification more carefully, the men became agitated. Their movements, which had been unnaturally smooth, became jerky and uncertain. They stood abruptly, stated that they had the information they needed, and left. She watched through her office window as they climbed into a black sedan with darkly tinted windows and no visible license plates. Connie Carpenter, the young woman who had encountered the Mothman on the road near her home, received a visit that was even more disturbing. Two men arrived at her door late one evening after dark. They wore black suits that seemed outdated in style, cut in a way that suggested the 1940s or 50s rather than the contemporary 1960s. They wore dark glasses despite the nighttime hour. Their faces were pale to the point of appearing bloodless. They identified themselves as Air Force investigators looking into unusual phenomena reports. They asked her to describe her encounter in exhaustive detail, wanting to know not just what she'd seen, but what she'd felt, what she'd thought, whether she'd experienced any physical symptoms afterward. They asked if she'd told many people about the encounter, whether she planned to speak to media again, whether she believed what she'd seen was real. The questions became stranger. They asked about her family history, her medical background, whether she'd ever experienced missing time or unexplained gaps in her memory, whether she believed in life on other planets. The conversation felt less like an official investigation and more like an interrogation designed to determine something about her personally. When Carpenter's husband returned home unexpectedly and entered the room, the men's demeanour changed dramatically. They became visibly uncomfortable, their previously formal composure cracking. They moved toward the door with hurried, awkward movements. One of them stumbled slightly, as if unfamiliar with the basic act of walking. They left abruptly, climbing into a dark vehicle that drove away with unusual speed. Carpenter and her husband immediately noted strange details about the visit. The men had left no business cards. The vehicle had no visible plates or identification. The Air Force identification they'd shown hadn't included names, just badge numbers that seemed too long, 8 or 9 digits rather than the standard format. And most disturbingly, when Carpenter later contacted the Air Force base nearest to Point Pleasant to verify that investigators had been sent to interview her, the base had no record of any such visit. The pattern of these visits became clear as more witnesses came forward. The visitors always came in pairs or groups of 3. They always wore dark suits, black or very dark grey, that were either brand new or somehow maintained in pristine condition, despite the muddy roads and winter weather of rural West Virginia. They wore dark glasses even at night or indoors. They drove dark sedans with tinted windows, but the most consistent element was their behaviour. Every witness who received such a visit described the same fundamental wrongness in how these men acted. They spoke in formal, stilted language that sounded like it came from a script. They moved in ways that seemed slightly off, too smooth or too jerky, but never quite natural. They seemed confused by ordinary objects or social conventions. They asked questions that started as reasonable investigation but veered into bizarre territory. Some witnesses reported that the men seemed to know things they shouldn't, details about private conversations, information about other witnesses that hadn't been made public, specific descriptions of sightings that matched the witness's experience but that the witness hadn't shared with anyone. This suggested either remarkable intelligence gathering or something more unsettling, precognitive knowledge or surveillance capabilities that exceeded anything normal investigators would possess. The vehicles these men drove were consistently described in similar terms: brand new American-made sedans, usually Cadillacs or Lincolns, in black or very dark colours. Windows tinted far darker than was standard or legal. Immaculately maintained, without mud or road dust despite driving on the unpaved roads around Point Pleasant. No visible license plates, or plates that witnesses couldn't quite focus on or remember afterward. Several people reported seeing these vehicles driving slowly through town at odd hours, 2 or 3 in the morning, moving at crawling speeds through residential neighbourhoods, as if the occupants were looking for something. The vehicles would sometimes park near a witness's home for extended periods, just sitting there with engines idling, then drive away when approached or when someone called police. John Keel encountered these figures repeatedly during his investigation. He was followed constantly, dark vehicles appearing in his rearview mirror on country roads, maintaining precise distance behind him. He received visits at his accommodation, always late at night, from men who asked questions about his investigation in that same unsettling, artificial manner. One visit particularly disturbed him. 2 men arrived at his door after midnight. They were dressed in the standard dark suits, with dark glasses worn despite the late hour. They asked to come in, and Keel, curious about the phenomenon and confident in his ability to handle most situations, allowed them entry. The men sat in chairs in his room and proceeded to ask questions about his research. But their questions revealed knowledge they shouldn't possess. They referenced interviews Keel had conducted that day, interviews that hadn't been publicised or discussed with anyone. They mentioned conversations Keel had had on the telephone with colleagues in other states. They asked about his theories regarding the Mothman with specificity that suggested they'd read his private notes. The conversation lasted perhaps 30 minutes. Throughout, Keel noticed the same elements other witnesses had reported. The men didn't blink normally. Their eyes would remain open for unsettling periods, then they would blink several times in rapid succession. Their skin had an odd pallor, almost greyish. Their movements were stiff and precise, as if they were consciously controlling each gesture rather than moving naturally. When Keel asked direct questions about their identity and authority, they provided answers that sounded plausible but were deliberately vague. Government investigators, they said, looking into unusual phenomena that might have national security implications. They couldn't provide specific agency names for reasons of classification. They showed identification that looked authentic but that Keel couldn't examine closely. They held it briefly, and then returned it to pockets before he could note details. Then they delivered what seemed like a warning. They told Keel that his investigation was attracting unwanted attention, that he should consider whether the information he was gathering was worth the personal cost of continuing, that some questions were better left unasked. The words were carefully chosen, never quite crossing into overt threat, but the implication was clear. After they left, Keel examined his room carefully. Nothing was obviously disturbed, but he had the distinct impression that the visit had been as much about establishing surveillance presence as about delivering any message. He felt watched constantly from that point forward. The identity and purpose of these mysterious visitors became one of the enduring mysteries of the Mothman case. The term Men in Black had been used in UFO circles for years to describe similar encounters, mysterious figures in dark suits who visited UFO witnesses and warned them not to discuss what they'd seen. The phenomenon had been reported across the country, dating back to the early 1950s. Several theories emerged to explain the Men in Black. Some researchers believed they were government agents, perhaps from military intelligence or classified research programs, monitoring phenomena that had national security implications. The awkward behaviour and unusual questioning could be explained as poor field training or deliberate intimidation tactics designed to discredit witnesses by association with crazy conspiracy theories. But this explanation had problems. The level of knowledge the visitors displayed, private conversations, unpublicised details, suggested either surveillance capabilities far beyond what was reasonable for low-priority investigations, or access to information through methods that didn't fit standard intelligence gathering. The vehicles with no plates violated basic operational security that any real government agent would maintain. And most significantly, when witnesses tried to verify these visits with official agencies, they found no record of any such investigations. Keel developed a different theory. He came to believe that the Men in Black were not human agents, but were part of the same phenomenon that manifested as the Mothman. They were projections or constructs, entities that appeared human but couldn't quite maintain the performance. They were intelligence operating from outside normal reality, attempting to interact with humans but lacking perfect understanding of how humans actually behaved. This would explain the stilted language, beings who understood the mechanics of human speech but not the subtleties. The awkward movements, entities controlling physical forms but not perfectly. The knowledge of private information, beings that existed in states where time or consciousness operated differently, giving them access to information through means that weren't physical surveillance. It would also explain why the visit served no obvious practical purpose. If the goal was genuinely to suppress information, The methods were counterproductive. The visits themselves became part of the mystery, adding to rather than reducing public interest. But if the goal was simply to interact, to study human reactions, to be present during significant events, then the visits made more sense as observation than intervention. The Men in Black phenomenon added a layer of paranoia and uncertainty to the already strange events in Point Pleasant. Witnesses who might have continued discussing their experiences publicly became reluctant to do so after receiving such visits. The sense that something larger was happening, that the Mothman sightings were part of a broader pattern of high strangeness, deepened among both witnesses and investigators, and the visits continued throughout the winter and into spring of 1967, maintaining a steady presence alongside the creature sightings. Whatever was happening in Point Pleasant had attracted attention from entities or agencies that operated outside normal channels of authority and understanding. The question of what the Men in Black actually were remains debated to this day. Government agents, extraterrestrial visitors, interdimensional entities, psychological projections somehow given temporary physical form, or something else entirely, something that defies our categories and exists in spaces our science hasn't yet learned to map. But for the witnesses who encountered them, the truth was simpler and more frightening. Something that looked almost human but wasn't quite right had come to their doors and asked questions in the middle of the night, and whatever these visitors were, they were connected to the creature with wings and glowing red eyes that was haunting their town. Chapter 6. The Prophecy Angle. As 1967 progressed and the Mothman sightings continued with disturbing regularity, a pattern emerged that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. Witnesses weren't just seeing the creature, they were experiencing precognitive phenomena, dreams of future events, intuitions that proved accurate, warnings delivered through unexplained means that seemed to predict disasters before they occurred. These reports were difficult to categorize and even more difficult to investigate properly. Precognition challenges fundamental assumptions about causality and time. Most scientists dismiss such reports as confirmation bias. People have hundreds of dreams and intuitions, and when one happens to align with a future event, they remember that one and forget the hundreds of false predictions. But in Point Pleasant during 1967, the volume and specificity of precognitive reports exceeded what random chance would predict. One woman, a housewife with no history of psychic claims or unusual experiences, reported a disturbing dream in early December of 1966. She dreamed of dark water and Christmas tragedy. She saw twisted metal and heard screaming. She saw emergency lights reflected in dark river water. The dream recurred several times over the following weeks, each time with the same basic imagery, but increasing emotional intensity. She mentioned the dream to her family and close friends, though she had no context for what it might mean. Point Pleasant was a peaceful town. There was no obvious source of Christmas tragedy, but the dream disturbed her enough that she documented it in her personal journal, noting the dates of each recurrence and the specific images that appeared. 3 weeks later, the Silver Bridge would collapse during Christmas shopping season, sending vehicles into the dark waters of the Ohio River, while emergency lights illuminated the rescue efforts. Another witness, a factory worker who had seen the Mothman twice near the TNT area, reported receiving a strange phone call in mid-November of 1967. The caller's voice was distorted and mechanical, as if generated by primitive text-to-speech technology. The message was cryptic but disturbing. December will bring change. Many will be affected. The bridge. The worker tried to ask for clarification, but the line went dead. He mentioned the call to co-workers but didn't report it to authorities. It seemed too vague to constitute a threat, and he assumed it was a prank related to the Mothman publicity. But after the bridge collapse, he contacted John Keel and described the call in detail, providing specific dates and times that Keel was able to verify through phone records. Mary Heyer, the journalist, documented dozens of similar accounts as part of her comprehensive reporting on the Mothman phenomenon. People reporting feelings of dread that intensified as the year progressed, intuitions that something significant and terrible was approaching, dreams featuring dark water, falling, twisted metal, and overwhelming sadness. Some of these reports came from people who had never had Mothman sightings, suggesting that whatever was causing the precognitive experiences was broader than direct encounters with the creature. But many came from witnesses who had seen the Mothman, and these witnesses often described feeling that the creature itself was somehow connected to their premonitions. Several people reported experiencing mental impressions during Mothman encounters. Not words or language, but emotional or conceptual communication that bypassed verbal thought. One witness described it as feeling the creature's purpose without understanding it, like knowing someone is trying to tell you something important, but speaking a language you don't know. Another witness, a teenager who had seen the creature perched on a power line near his home, described the experience in even more specific terms. When it looked at me, I felt overwhelmed with this sense of wrongness. Not that the creature was wrong, but that something was wrong. Like reality itself was off balance and about to tip over. I couldn't explain it then, and I still can't, but I knew something bad was coming. These descriptions suggested that the Mothman might be attempting communication through means other than language or gesture, that its appearances were deliberate attempts to create awareness of approaching danger. But without a shared method of communication, the warnings remained vague and uninterpretable until after the fact. Keel was fascinated and disturbed by these reports. As a journalist with a background in skeptical investigation, he found precognition philosophically problematic. If future events could be known before they occurred, it challenged basic assumptions about causality and free will. But the volume of reports and the specificity of some predictions exceeded what he could comfortably dismiss as coincidence or post-event rationalization. He began keeping a separate file of prophecy-related accounts, documenting each report with careful attention to dates and details. He noted when predictions were made, what specific information they contained, and whether they were later verified. He tried to remain objective, acknowledging that most precognitive claims would prove false or too vague to verify, but documenting everything thoroughly enough that any genuine pattern would be visible. What emerged from his analysis was troubling. The frequency of precognitive experiences had increased dramatically since the Mothman sightings began. People who had never previously claimed psychic abilities were having vivid prophetic dreams. The content of these experiences clustered around specific themes: water, bridges, falling, December, emergency lights, tragedy during holiday celebrations. Keel also noticed an increase in reported UFO activity over the Ohio River Valley during the same period. Witnesses described unusual lights moving in patterns that didn't match conventional aircraft. Objects hovering silently over the water, bright flashes that illuminated the entire sky for brief moments. Some of these reports came from the same witnesses who were having precognitive experiences, suggesting a possible connection between all the phenomena. He began to theorize that something was happening in Point Pleasant that went beyond simple creature sightings, that the town was experiencing a window period, his term for times and places where barriers between normal reality and whatever lay beyond became permeable. During window periods, multiple types of high strangeness manifested simultaneously: UFO sightings, cryptid encounters, poltergeist activity, precognitive experiences, and encounters with entities like the Men in Black. The Mothman, in this framework, wasn't causing the other phenomena. It was one manifestation among many of whatever underlying process was occurring, and that process was somehow connected to approaching tragedy, either drawing energy from the future event or existing in a state where the future was already visible and trying to communicate warnings backward through time. This interpretation suggested that the Mothman wasn't a creature in any biological sense. It was more like a symptom or a sign, a way that approaching disaster made itself visible to those sensitive enough to perceive it. The glowing red eyes weren't just physical features but symbolic representations of warning. The massive wings weren't for flight but for visibility, making the messenger large enough and strange enough to be impossible to ignore. But warnings from entities that exist outside human linguistic and temporal frameworks are nearly impossible to interpret correctly. The Mothman appeared. People saw it. They felt disturbed and alerted. They knew something was wrong, but without clear context they couldn't, next, determine what specifically was approaching or how to prevent it. In hindsight, many witnesses would report that they'd felt the Mothman was trying to warn them about something, that the creature's persistence, appearing night after night, location after location, to witness after witness, was deliberate communication rather than random activity. That if they'd been able to properly interpret what they were seeing and feeling, they might have understood that the bridge was dangerous, that December 15th was going to bring tragedy, that 46 people would die if nobody acted. But prophecy without clear translation is just anxiety, and by late 1967, as winter approached and the anniversary of the first sighting drew near, that anxiety was building toward a breaking point. Something terrible was coming. The Mothman had been trying to warn them for 13 months, and time was running out. Chapter 7. The Silver Bridge Collapse. December 15th, 1967. Friday afternoon, the week before Christmas. Point Pleasant was busy with holiday shoppers and workers finishing their shifts before the weekend. The downtown stores were decorated for the season. Families were finalising plans for Christmas celebrations. The mood in town was festive despite the undercurrent of unease from 13 months of Mothman sightings. The Silver Bridge stood as it had for nearly 40 years, a suspension bridge connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio, across the Ohio River. The structure was an engineering marvel of its era, built in 1928 using an innovative I-bar chain design. Instead of cables supporting the roadway, massive steel bars linked together like a giant chain bore the weight of the bridge and everything crossing it. Route 17, a major regional highway, crossed the Ohio River via the Silver Bridge. The structure carried an average of 4,000 vehicles per day, serving as the primary connection between the two states for dozens of miles in either direction. For residents on both sides of the river, the bridge was essential infrastructure they used constantly without thinking about it. That Friday afternoon, the bridge was packed with traffic. Rush hour combined with holiday shopping created bumper-to-bumper conditions across the entire span. Cars idled in both directions, their engines running, exhaust visible in the cold December air. On the bridge's pedestrian walkway, people made their way across on foot, some carrying shopping bags, others just crossing to reach destinations on the opposite shore. The weather was cold but clear, temperature in the low 30s, no rain, no ice, no obvious conditions that would stress the structure. Just typical December weather in West Virginia, and typical Friday afternoon traffic on a vital piece of infrastructure. At approximately 5:04 in the afternoon, something failed. An I-bar in the suspension chain, a single piece of steel roughly 55 feet long, fractured completely. The metal had been weakened by decades of stress and by a microscopic flaw that had existed since the bar was manufactured in the 1920s. The defect was invisible to inspection, hidden within the solid steel, growing slowly over nearly 40 years until it reached critical failure point. When the I-bar broke, it triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The load previously carried by that single bar redistributed to adjacent bars, overloading them instantly. Those bars failed within seconds. The suspension chain separated, releasing one side of the roadway from its support. The bridge didn't collapse slowly. There was no gradual sagging that would have given drivers time to stop or pedestrians time to run. The roadway dropped from beneath vehicles in sudden, violent motion. The entire structure twisted and fell apart in approximately 1 minute from initial failure to complete collapse. Witness accounts from shore described a scene of unimaginable horror. The bridge roadway broke into sections, each piece falling toward the river at different angles. Vehicles toppled into the water, some falling straight down, others sliding as sections tilted before breaking completely. The sound was overwhelming. Screaming metal, breaking concrete, car horns, engines revving uselessly, and human voices crying out in terror and confusion. 75 vehicles were on the bridge when it collapsed. More than 100 people, drivers and passengers were on the structure. The river below was the Ohio in winter, cold enough that survival time in the water was measured in minutes. The current was strong enough to sweep wreckage and victims downstream. The impact of vehicles hitting water from significant height was often immediately fatal. Emergency responders arrived within minutes to find chaos beyond anything they'd trained for. Point Pleasant was a small town with limited emergency services. The scale of disaster overwhelmed available resources immediately. Rescue boats launched into the freezing river, searching for survivors among the wreckage. Divers prepared to search submerged vehicles. Medical personnel set up triage areas on both shores. Some people survived the initial collapse through chance or position. Vehicles near the edges of the bridge landed on partially collapsed sections of roadway, rather than in deep water. Some drivers were able to escape their vehicles and swim to shore before hypothermia set in. Others were pulled from the water by quick-thinking rescuers who launched private boats before official emergency services arrived. But many others didn't survive. Vehicles trapped underwater with occupants unable to escape before the cold water induced unconsciousness. Bodies swept downstream by the current. Some recovered quickly, others not found for days or weeks. Impact trauma from the fall that killed instantly. Hypothermia that claimed victims who survived the initial impact but couldn't reach shore before the cold water stopped their hearts. The final death toll was 46 people. 18 vehicles remained submerged in the river for extended periods, requiring specialised recovery operations. Some bodies weren't recovered for weeks. The youngest victim was an infant. The oldest were elderly couples who had been crossing the bridge to reach Christmas shopping destinations. Point Pleasant, with a population of barely 5,000, went into shock. Nearly every family in town knew someone who had died or been injured. The scale of loss was devastating. Christmas celebrations were cancelled. Churches filled with grieving families. The small town newspaper struggled to document the scope of tragedy. While dealing with its own grief, several staff members had lost relatives in the collapse. Emergency declarations brought state and federal resources to assist with rescue and recovery operations. The National Transportation Safety Board dispatched investigators to determine the cause of collapse. Engineering teams arrived to examine the wreckage and understand exactly what had failed and why. Media from around the country descended on Point Pleasant, documenting both the tragedy and the recovery efforts, and the Mothman sightings stopped. Almost immediately after the disaster, the reports ceased. The creature that had been seen regularly for 13 months simply vanished. The TNT area returned to quiet abandonment. The strange phone calls ended. The men in black departed or stopped making themselves visible. Whatever had been present in Point Pleasant was gone. The correlation was impossible to ignore. For 13 months the creature had appeared with disturbing regularity, creating a pattern of high strangeness that had put the town on edge. Dozens of witnesses had reported encounters. Hundreds more had heard the reports and felt increasing unease. Then tragedy struck, swift, sudden, and devastating. And the phenomenon ended precisely when the disaster occurred. Was it coincidence? Or was there a connection that challenged everything witnesses thought they understood about reality, causality, and time? Chapter 8. Coincidence or correlation? In the immediate aftermath of the Silver Bridge collapse, investigators and engineers focused on determining the physical cause of failure. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted an exhaustive examination of the wreckage, recovering key structural components from the river and analysing them in detail. Their findings were conclusive and disturbing. The collapse resulted from the catastrophic failure of a single eye bar in one of the suspension chains. The bar contained a microscopic defect, a tiny crack that had existed since the steel was manufactured in the 1920s. Over 40 years of constant stress, the defect had grown slowly, weakening the bar until it reached the point where it could no longer support the load. The defect was located in a position that made inspection nearly impossible. Visual examination wouldn't have revealed it. Standard inspection procedures of the era weren't designed to detect this type of internal flaw. The bridge had been inspected regularly and considered safe based on all available information and standard engineering practices. But in hindsight, warning signs had existed. The eye-bar design itself was known by the 1960s to have limitations. It created single points of failure where a single component breaking could trigger catastrophic collapse. Newer bridges used cable suspension systems with redundancy built in. Several engineers had suggested the bridge should be replaced with modern design. but budget constraints and the expense of such a project had delayed action. The collapse was preventable in the sense that if the defective eye-bar had been identified and replaced, the tragedy wouldn't have occurred. But with the technology and inspection protocols available at the time, there was no realistic way to have discovered the flaw before failure. The official explanation was thorough, scientifically sound, and based on physical evidence that could be examined and verified. It satisfied engineering requirements for understanding what had happened and preventing future similar failures. Modern inspection protocols and bridge design standards were updated based on lessons learned from the Point Pleasant disaster. But that explanation, while factually accurate regarding the immediate physical cause, didn't address the larger questions that haunted witnesses and investigators. Why had the Mothman appeared exactly 13 months before the collapse? Why had precognitive dreams and warnings increased in frequency as the disaster approached? Why had the sightings focused on Point Pleasant, rather than any other location with an aging bridge? Why had the phenomenon ended the moment the disaster occurred? The skeptical position was straightforward and logical. The bridge was deteriorating for decades. Its failure was inevitable given the hidden defect and the increasing traffic loads. The Mothman was either misidentification of ordinary animals, perhaps sandhill cranes or large owls, or a combination of mass hysteria, media amplification, and a few genuine hoaxes. The timing was pure coincidence. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures who see connections where none exist, especially in the wake of tragedy. The precognitive dreams were either fabricated after the fact or were the statistically inevitable result of many people having many dreams, some of which would randomly align with future events. This explanation had the advantage of requiring no violation of known physical laws. It demanded no supernatural forces or unexplained phenomena. It fit comfortably within materialist worldview and conventional understanding of reality. For many people, it was and remains the only acceptable interpretation. But this explanation had significant problems that bothered even some skeptics. First, the consistency and volume of witness descriptions. Over 100 people from diverse backgrounds reported seeing essentially the same thing. Grey humanoid figure, 6 to 7 feet tall, massive wings spanning 10 or more feet, large glowing red eyes. These witnesses included police officers, veterans, business owners, factory workers, housewives, people with varying levels of education and credibility, but united in describing experiences that terrified them. Misidentification of known animals couldn't easily account for such consistency across independent reports. Sandhill cranes, the most commonly proposed explanation, do have red patches on their heads and impressive wingspans of up to 7 feet. They migrate through the region, but they don't reach 7 feet in height. They can't fly at 70 miles per hour for extended distances. Their eyes don't glow red at night. The red patches are on their heads, not their eyes. They don't hover in place or vanish instantaneously. They're shy birds that avoid human contact rather than repeatedly appearing near populated areas. Second, the temporal pattern. The sightings began in November of 1966 and ended in December of 1967, a 13-month window that aligned precisely with the period before the collapse. The start date wasn't gradual. The phenomenon emerged suddenly with the Scarberry-Mallet encounter and immediately became frequent and consistent. The end date was similarly abrupt. The creature appeared regularly until the bridge fell, then disappeared completely. If the phenomenon was random animal sightings misidentified due to hysteria, why would it start and stop so cleanly? Why would it maintain consistent patterns for exactly 13 months? Third, the precognitive elements. Multiple witnesses reported dreams and premonitions of disaster before the collapse occurred, and crucially, several of these were documented before the tragedy. The housewife's journal entries describing dreams of dark water and Christmas tragedy. The factory worker's phone call mentioning December, change, and bridges. Mary Hyre's documentation of multiple witnesses reporting increasing feelings of dread and specific imagery that later matched the actual disaster. These weren't retrofitted memories. They were recorded predictions that proved accurate. Statistical analysis of precognitive claims is complex, but the volume and specificity of correct predictions in Point Pleasant during 1967 exceeded baseline expectations significantly. Even accounting for false memories, selective reporting, and the tendency to remember hits and forget misses, the pattern was remarkable enough to warrant serious consideration. Fourth, the behaviour of the phenomenon. If the Mothman was simply a misidentified animal or a series of hoaxes, certain behavioural elements made no sense. The creature never attacked anyone despite dozens of close encounters. It appeared in ways that maximised witness observation rather than avoiding detection. It returned to the same general area repeatedly rather than moving on as an actual animal would. It displayed flight capabilities that exceeded known species. It appeared to multiple independent witnesses on the same nights in locations that would require impossibly rapid travel between sightings. These behavioural patterns suggested either an intelligent entity deliberately staging encounters, or something that wasn't constrained by the physical limitations that would govern a biological creature. John Keel's interpretation evolved throughout his investigation and his subsequent analysis. By the time he published The Mothman Prophecies in 1975, he had developed a comprehensive theory that attempted to account for all aspects of the phenomenon rather than just the creature sightings. Keel proposed that the Mothman was not a biological cryptid, but a manifestation of intelligence operating outside normal physical constraints. He used the term ultra-terrestrial to describe entities that existed in dimensions or states parallel to our own and occasionally intersected with human reality. These weren't extraterrestrial visitors from other planets, but rather intelligences that existed alongside humanity in spaces or dimensions that normal human perception couldn't access. In Keel's framework, the bridge collapse was an event of such magnitude that it created ripples through whatever dimensional space these intelligences inhabited. The disaster was visible to them before it occurred in human linear time, either because they existed in states where time functioned differently, or because major events created temporal distortions that extended both forward and backward. The Mothman appeared because it was drawn to the location by the approaching tragedy. It manifested in a form that would be memorable and disturbing to human witnesses: wings for visibility, red eyes for symbolism, humanoid shape for partial comprehensibility. It appeared repeatedly because it was attempting to create awareness, to warn in the only way available to an intelligence that couldn't speak human language or manipulate human reality directly. But warnings from entities that exist outside human linguistic and conceptual frameworks are nearly impossible to interpret correctly. The Mothman showed itself. People saw it. They talked about it. They became alert and uneasy. But without clear communication, the message remained ambiguous until after the tragedy occurred, and context made everything clear in retrospect. This interpretation was controversial and remains debated. It required accepting the existence of intelligence beyond what science had documented. It challenged materialist understanding of reality by proposing dimensions or states of being that couldn't be measured with current technology. It suggested that time might not function as straightforwardly as human experience suggests, that future events might somehow affect past moments in ways that violated conventional causality. Skeptics found this framework unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific. If physical evidence for the Mothman could be explained away as manifestation from another dimension, then the theory could never be disproven. It became essentially a religious or philosophical position rather than a scientific hypothesis. But Keel wasn't attempting to produce a falsifiable scientific theory. He was attempting to create a framework that accounted for all reported phenomena, not just the creature sightings but the men in black encounters, the precognitive dreams, the electrical disturbances, the strange phone calls, the sense of intelligence and purpose behind everything that happened. No single explanation from conventional science and materialism could encompass all these elements coherently. Other researchers proposed alternative theories. Some suggested government involvement, that the Mothman was connected to secret experiments at the TNT area, perhaps involving psychoactive chemicals or psychological warfare research. The men in black could be genuine government agents monitoring the situation. The prophecies could be the result of subconscious detection of real warning signs, people noticing structural problems with the bridge or behavioural changes in animals that signalled approaching disaster. This explanation had the advantage of requiring only expanded government secrecy rather than violation of physical laws, but it struggled to account for the specific behavioural patterns of the Mothman and the Men in Black. It didn't explain why such experiments would be conducted in ways guaranteed to attract massive public attention. It didn't address the correlation between the phenomenon and the disaster. Some paranormal researchers suggested psychic or consciousness-based explanations. Perhaps the Mothman was a collective thought form, an entity created by human fear and expectation, given temporary reality by the focused attention of thousands of people. Perhaps the approaching disaster created psychological disturbances that manifested as visions and experiences. Perhaps certain individuals were genuinely psychic, and their precognitive abilities were triggered by the proximity of tragedy. These theories struggled with the physical aspects of the phenomenon, the multiple witness sightings, the documented pursuit of vehicles, the consistency of descriptions across witnesses who had no contact with each other. What remained undeniable, regardless of interpretation, was the pattern. Something extraordinary happened in Point Pleasant between November of 1966 and December of 1967. Whether that something was biological, interdimensional, psychological or technological, it left a permanent mark on everyone who witnessed it, and 46 people died in a disaster that may or may not have been connected to 13 months of impossible encounters. The Silver Bridge was never rebuilt at its original location. A new bridge was constructed downstream, modern in design with multiple redundancies built in. The original site remains empty, a gap in the river crossing where 100 people crossed on a December afternoon and 46 never returned. In the decades since, engineers and investigators have occasionally re-examined the bridge collapse, applying new analytical techniques and inspection technologies to understand exactly what happened. The core conclusion remains unchanged: a microscopic defect in a single eye bar, impossible to detect with available technology, that finally failed after 40 years of stress. But that explanation, accurate as it is regarding immediate physical causality, still doesn't address the deeper mystery. Why did something impossible appear in Point Pleasant for 13 months before the tragedy? What was it trying to communicate? And if it was genuinely attempting to warn the town, why couldn't that warning be understood until after 46 people had died? Those questions remain unanswered, and they continue to haunt everyone who examines the Mothman case with genuine attention to all available evidence rather than dismissing what doesn't fit comfortable explanations. Chapter 9. Not a creature, but a phenomenon. John Keel's final analysis of the Mothman events, developed over years of reflection following the bridge collapse, represented a fundamental shift in how cryptid sightings and related phenomena might be understood. He wasn't just investigating a strange creature anymore. He was documenting something that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself. Keel had spent years before Point Pleasant investigating UFOs and paranormal phenomena across the United States. He had interviewed thousands of witnesses, documented hundreds of cases, and accumulated a massive archive of reports that shared common elements despite occurring in different locations and time periods. He began to see patterns that suggested these apparently separate phenomena, UFO sightings, cryptid encounters, poltergeist activity, Men in Black visits, precognitive experiences, were not distinct categories but different manifestations of the same underlying process. He called this underlying process ultra-terrestrial activity, and he dedicated much of his later work to developing a comprehensive theory that could account for the full spectrum of high strangeness that appeared in certain locations during certain time periods. The Mothman, in Keel's analysis, was not a biological entity. It was a temporary manifestation of intelligence that existed outside conventional reality. It took a form that would be memorable and disturbing to human witnesses, but not entirely incomprehensible. Wings, because humans understand birds, and flight. Red eyes, because they convey intelligence, awareness, and warning. A humanoid shape, because pure alien form would be too foreign for human minds to process and remember. This projection theory explains several puzzling aspects of the sightings that biological explanations struggled with. Why the creature left no physical evidence, no footprints, no droppings, no shed material, nothing that would confirm it was a flesh and blood animal. Why it could appear and disappear instantaneously rather than flying away visibly. Why it seemed to defy aerodynamics and physics in its movement, hovering without visible effort, matching car speeds that should require enormous energy expenditure, disappearing mid-flight. It also explained the prophecy angle. If the Mothman existed in a state where linear time functioned differently, or where major future events were somehow visible before they occurred in normal human time, then its appearances were attempts to create awareness of approaching disaster using the only method available. It couldn't speak human language, it couldn't write warnings or make phone calls with clear messages, but it could manifest in a form that would be seen, discussed and remembered. It could create a pattern of high strangeness that would put the community on alert and make people more observant and cautious. Keel noted that the Mothman never attacked anyone despite numerous close encounters. This suggested either benevolent intent or simply lack of interest in causing direct harm. The creature's goal appeared to be communication rather than predation. It wanted witnesses. It needed people to see it, to talk about it, to create a comprehensive record of its presence. The repeated appearances at similar locations, the willingness to be photographed, even if photographs didn't capture clear images, the tendency to appear to multiple witnesses rather than isolated individuals, all suggested deliberate visibility rather than animal behaviour. The form the Mothman chose had precedent in folklore and religious imagery across cultures. Winged humanoids appeared in ancient texts and modern reports worldwide. Angels and demons in Judeo-Christian tradition, gargoyles in European architecture, thunderbirds in Native American lore, Tengu in Japanese folklore. The archetype of the winged messenger or harbinger existed in human consciousness long before Point Pleasant. Perhaps, Keel suggested, the phenomenon drew on these existing templates when manifesting in ways humans could perceive. It accessed the collective unconscious or cultural memory and produced a form that carried symbolic weight, a messenger with wings, a harbinger with burning eyes, not because it actually had those physical features, but because projecting that appearance created the desired psychological and cultural response in witnesses. This interpretation moved the Mothman out of cryptozoology entirely. It was no longer a question of what species the creature might be or where it lived when not being observed. It was instead a question of what type of intelligence could project itself into human perceptible form, what dimensional or consciousness-based space such intelligence inhabited, and what it was trying to achieve through manifestation. Keel connected the Mothman phenomenon to UFO sightings through similar principles. Many UFO encounters involved craft that seemed to violate physics, making right-angle turns at high speed, hovering silently, disappearing instantaneously. Witnesses often reported time distortions, telepathic communication, and physical effects similar to what Mothman witnesses described. Some UFO encounters included humanoid entities that seemed slightly wrong, too perfect, too strange, not quite convincing as biological beings. Keel proposed that both phenomena were manifestations of ultra-terrestrial intelligence, entities that existed in states parallel to human reality and occasionally intersected with our dimensional space. UFOs might not be physical craft from other planets, but rather projections designed to be visible to humans. The entities associated with them might not be extraterrestrial biological entities, but rather constructs or avatars created for temporary interaction. This framework was controversial and remains highly debated. It required accepting several propositions that mainstream science found difficult to evaluate. That consciousness or intelligence could exist independent of biological substrate. That dimensions or states of being beyond the three spatial dimensions and one time dimension humans experience directly might exist and be inhabited. That entities in such spaces might be able to project manifestations into human perceptible reality without being fully present in conventional physical terms. The theory was also frustratingly vague in specifics. What exactly were these other dimensions? How did projection from them into human reality work mechanically? What were the rules and limitations? Why would such intelligences bother manifesting to humans at all? Keel provided frameworks and speculation, but couldn't offer concrete mechanisms or testable predictions. Skeptics noted that the theory could explain anything, and therefore explained nothing. Any lack of physical evidence supported the projection theory. Any strange behaviour confirmed non-physical origin. The framework was essentially unfalsifiable. There was no observation or evidence that could disprove it. This made it interesting philosophy or speculative metaphysics, but not science in the conventional sense. Keel acknowledged these limitations, but argued that conventional science was simply inadequate for addressing the full spectrum of reported phenomena. If you limited investigation only to questions that could be resolved with materialist assumptions and current technology, you would never be able to account for the full range of human experience. Sometimes, he suggested, you had to develop new frameworks even if they couldn't be immediately verified, because the old frameworks demonstrably failed to account for documented observations. The Mothman, in Keel's final analysis, was a messenger. Not a biological creature waiting to be captured and studied, but a temporary manifestation of something vast and strange that occasionally makes itself known to humans. It appeared because something significant was approaching, a disaster visible to entities that existed in states where time functioned differently than human linear experience. It persisted because the message wasn't being understood. It vanished because the event it was signalling had finally occurred, and there was no longer any reason to maintain the warning. Whether this interpretation is correct remains unknowable with current understanding and technology, but it offers a framework that respects witness testimony, acknowledges the strangeness without dismissing it, and admits that reality might be far more complex than materialist science currently allows. It treats the Mothman not as a hoax or delusion or misidentification, but as genuine phenomenon that reveals the limitations of current scientific paradigms. And it leaves open the possibility that the Mothman might appear again. That if another disaster of sufficient magnitude approached, another community might experience 13 months of impossible sightings. That somewhere, in dimensional spaces humans can't directly access, intelligence exists that occasionally tries to warn us when tragedy approaches, using the only methods available to beings that exist outside our conventional reality. The messenger might take different forms in different cultural contexts. It might appear as wings and red eyes in West Virginia, as luminous spheres in other locations, as beings of light or shadow, as voices without source, or visions without physical cause. But the purpose would remain the same: to create awareness, to signal approaching disaster, to warn in whatever way entities outside normal time and space can warn those trapped within it. Whether any human can properly interpret such warnings remains an open question. But Point Pleasant suggests that at minimum, the attempt is made. That something tried to warn the town for 13 months. That 46 people died anyway, not because the warning was absent, but because it couldn't be translated into actionable information until after the tragedy made its meaning clear. Chapter 10. Why Point Pleasant was chosen. The question of why Point Pleasant became the focal point for this phenomenon has occupied researchers, skeptics, and believers for more than 50 years. The town itself was unremarkable before the Mothman appeared, a small river community in West Virginia, economically dependent on manufacturing and river commerce, with nothing in its history suggesting it should become the centre of one of the most extensively documented paranormal events in American history. But location matters in ways that simple geography doesn't capture. Point Pleasant sits at a convergence point that might be significant from perspectives beyond conventional cartography. Geographically, Point Pleasant is positioned where the Kanawha River flows into the Ohio River, a junction of two significant waterways creating a natural confluence. Water has held symbolic and supposedly actual significance in folklore and paranormal research across cultures. Rivers as boundaries between worlds, confluences as liminal spaces where normal rules become permeable, points where flowing water meets as locations of power or transition. This might be dismissed as superstition, but hydrological factors do create unusual local conditions. The meeting of two river systems affects magnetic fields slightly. Groundwater flows and limestone geology beneath the area create conditions for piezoelectric effects under stress. Some researchers have suggested that unusual geological or hydrological features create electromagnetic anomalies that could affect both human perception and potentially enable or attract unusual phenomena. The area's indigenous history added another layer. The Ohio River Valley had been inhabited for thousands of years before European settlement. The Shawnee, Cherokee and other nations considered portions of this territory significant, though specific details of their traditions regarding these locations were not well documented by the time white settlers arrived. Native American oral traditions from the broader region include references to winged beings, spirits of warning, and locations where boundaries between the physical and spirit worlds became thin. Some researchers noted possible connections between the Mothman and indigenous lore about thunderbirds or other winged entities associated with power and prophecy. Whether these connections are meaningful or represent superficial pattern, matching remains debated. The TNT area itself held recent dark history. Thousands of tons of high explosives manufactured there during World War II. Chemical contamination from wartime production that persisted decades later. Underground tunnel networks connecting bunkers and storage facilities. The accumulated psychic weight, if such things exist, of industrial-scale explosive production and the inherent danger that came with that work. Some theorists suggested that certain types of human activity, particularly activity related to death, war or large-scale destruction, might create conditions that attract or enable paranormal phenomena, that the psychic residue of manufacturing materials designed to kill might leave impressions on a location, or more prosaically, that chemical contamination might affect human neurology in ways that increase susceptibility to unusual perceptual experiences. The timing was also potentially significant. The Mothman appeared during the mid-1960s, a period of intense social anxiety in America. The Cold War was at its peak. Nuclear annihilation felt like a genuine possibility. The Vietnam War was escalating and dividing the nation. The Kennedy assassination was recent history. Civil rights conflicts were intensifying. The counterculture movement was challenging traditional social structures. Some researchers propose that collective human consciousness during periods of intense stress might be more permeable to unusual phenomena. That when many people feel profound anxiety about catastrophe, they might become more sensitive to signals or warnings that normally go unnoticed, or that entities capable of manifesting in human perceptible forms might be drawn to locations where psychological stress creates favourable conditions for such manifestation. Others pointed to the infrastructure itself. The Silver Bridge was built in 1928, using a design that was, by the 1960s, outdated and known to have potential failure modes. The bridge was carrying far more traffic than it was originally designed for. Engineering studies conducted years before the collapse had noted concerns about the I-bar design's single points of failure. The approaching disaster was in some sense visible to anyone with engineering expertise examining the structure carefully. Perhaps some suggested the approaching catastrophe created conditions that allowed or attracted the phenomenon. That major disasters cast shadows backward through time in ways normal human perception doesn't detect, but that certain sensitive individuals or non-human intelligences might perceive. That the Mothman was drawn to Point Pleasant not because of anything special about the location, but because of the approaching tragedy, like moths drawn to flames, except drawn through time to disaster. John Keel suggested that the location mattered less than the event itself. The bridge collapse was the significant factor. The Mothman manifested wherever it needed to in order to create maximum awareness of approaching catastrophe. If the disaster had been scheduled to occur elsewhere, the phenomenon would have appeared there instead. But perhaps the simplest explanation, though simple doesn't mean correct, is that Point Pleasant was vulnerable in multiple ways that made it an ideal location for manifestation and documentation. A small town where strange reports would be taken seriously by local authorities but not immediately suppressed. A community tight-knit enough that information would spread quickly through social networks. A location remote enough to avoid constant outside scrutiny, but accessible enough that investigators like Keel could arrive and document events thoroughly. a place where witnesses would remember what they saw because they knew it was impossible, where law enforcement would file official reports rather than dismissing accounts, where journalists would document systematically rather than sensationalizing for entertainment, where the phenomenon could unfold over 13 months with enough visibility to ensure the story would be remembered and investigated for decades afterward. Whatever the reason, Point Pleasant became forever linked with the Mothman, the town that was visited by something impossible, the place where reality bent just enough for something else to slip through, the location where 100 witnesses saw a creature that shouldn't exist, and 46 people died in a tragedy that seemed impossible to separate from the 13 months of sightings that preceded it. The Silver Bridge collapse was a defining moment for Point Pleasant. The town lost part of its identity when those 46 people died, and the primary connection to Ohio was severed. Recovery took years. The new bridge downstream changed traffic patterns and commerce flows. The tragedy became the lens through which everything else in the town's history was viewed. But so did the Mothman. The creature sightings became inseparable from the bridge collapse in collective memory. The town embraced this eventually, transforming trauma and strangeness into identity and economic opportunity. The annual Mothman Festival draws thousands of visitors. The statue in the town centre has become an iconic image recognised internationally. Books, documentaries and films have told and retold the story, each version adding interpretation and emphasis. Yet beneath the commercialisation and cultural appropriation of the phenomenon, the genuine mystery remains. Something happened in Point Pleasant between November of 1966 and December of 1967 that no explanation fully captures. Witnesses saw something that terrified them. Precognitive warnings increased as tragedy approached. Tragedy struck with devastating force. The phenomenon ended when the disaster occurred. You can dismiss it as coincidence stacked upon misidentification amplified by media attention and crystallized by tragic disaster. You can accept it as genuine manifestation of interdimensional intelligence, attempting communication across barriers of language and time. You can position yourself anywhere along the spectrum between those poles, but the pattern remains and the questions remain. And Point Pleasant remains the town where the impossible refused to stay hidden, where something with wings and burning eyes appeared night after night for 13 months, and where 46 people died in a disaster that might have been foreseen but could not be prevented. Epilogue, the warning that remains. Today, the Ohio River flows past Point Pleasant just as it did on December the 15th, 1967. The current moves steadily, indifferent to the tragedy that occurred here, and indifferent to the 13 months of strangeness that preceded it. The water reflects sky and light, flowing as it has for millennia, connecting states and communities, serving as highway and boundary simultaneously. The new bridge stands downstream from where the Silver Bridge once connected Point Pleasant to Ohio. It's a modern structure, built with lessons learned from disaster and designed with redundancies that prevent single points of catastrophic failure. It carries Route 35 now, moved from the original Route 17 location. Traffic crosses constantly. Commuters, commercial trucks, tourists. Most drivers probably don't think about the engineering that keeps them suspended safely above the river. The bridge is reliable infrastructure, unremarkable in its competent function, but near the original site a small park preserves memory of what was lost. 46 names on a memorial, brief descriptions of who they were, the youngest, the oldest, the families travelling together who died together. The memorial is quiet, visited by relatives and by curious tourists who want to see where the tragedy occurred. The Ohio River flows past, relentless and unchanging, indifferent to human loss. In the centre of Point Pleasant stands another memorial, though this one commemorates something stranger than disaster. The Mothman statue rises on the corner of Main Street and 4th, a metallic figure with wings spread and muscular humanoid form, eyes gleaming red with internal illumination. It's become an iconic image, photographed constantly, appearing on countless websites and social media posts. The statue is art, tourism, commerce, mythology. It transforms trauma and mystery into something the town owns and controls. The annual Mothman Festival draws thousands of visitors each September. Vendors sell merchandise featuring the creature's distinctive silhouette. Authors present books analysing the sightings. Witnesses who are still alive occasionally appear to share their experiences. Researchers present theories. Skeptics present debunkings. The festival is celebration, investigation, and spectacle simultaneously. A strange hybrid of serious inquiry and commercial exploitation. The Mothman Museum documents the sightings with newspaper clippings, photographs, witness accounts, and artifacts from the era. It's a serious effort to preserve history, but it's also tourist attraction generating revenue. The dichotomy is uncomfortable. Genuine tragedy and mystery transformed into entertainment and economy. Yet perhaps this is how communities process trauma and strangeness. By incorporating the incomprehensible into daily life. By making the monster a mascot. By turning fear into something that can be controlled through representation and commerce. The witnesses who saw the Mothman carry their experiences privately now. Many have passed away. 60 years is a long time, and those who were adults in 1966 are elderly or gone now. Others remain but are reluctant to discuss what they encountered. The media attention was intense and often sceptical. Having your deepest fear dismissed as delusion or misidentification creates wounds that don't heal easily. Being associated with crazy conspiracy theories damages social standing and credibility. Some witnesses have participated in documentaries or written accounts of their experiences. Roger and Linda Scarberry, the couple whose November 15 encounter started the documented sightings, eventually shared their story multiple times. They never wavered from their account. They saw something impossible that night, something that terrified them so profoundly that 50 years later the memory remained vivid. Others chose silence. They know what they saw. They don't need external validation or explanation. They don't want the attention or the skepticism. They carry their encounter as private knowledge, occasionally mentioning it to trusted friends or family, but avoiding public discussion. John Keel continued investigating paranormal phenomena until his death in 2009. He wrote numerous books expanding his theories about ultra-terrestrial intelligence and the nature of reality. He never wavered from his interpretation of the Mothman events, that something intelligent and non-human manifested in Point Pleasant with purpose, that it tried to warn the town about approaching disaster, using the only methods available to entities that exist outside human linguistic and temporal frameworks, that it failed not through lack of effort, but because the message was impossible to translate into terms humans could act upon, until after tragedy made the meaning clear. Keel's work influenced generations of paranormal researchers and writers. His concept of ultra-terrestrials provided an alternative to the extraterrestrial hypothesis that dominated UFO research. His insistence on documenting high strangeness in all its manifestations, rather than focusing narrowly on craft sightings or creature encounters, created a more comprehensive approach to investigating the impossible. Critics argue that Keel's frameworks were unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific, that his theories could explain any observation and therefore had no predictive or explanatory power, that he had become too invested in his ideas to evaluate evidence objectively. These criticisms have merit from conventional scientific perspectives, but Keel's defense would be that conventional science was simply inadequate for addressing the phenomena he documented, that limiting investigation only to questions answerable within materialist frameworks guaranteed that the truly strange would remain permanently unexplained. The question that continues to haunt serious investigators isn't whether the Mothman was real. 100 witnesses, many of them credible and reluctant, reported essentially the same phenomenon. Multiple independent observers described the same creature on the same nights. Law enforcement documented sightings officially. Something was there. The question is what it was and why it appeared when and where it did. The bridge collapsed because of structural failure. That explanation is factually accurate and comprehensively documented. Engineering analysis proved exactly what failed and why. But that explanation doesn't account for the 13 months of sightings. It doesn't explain why the phenomenon ended when the disaster occurred. It doesn't address the precognitive dreams, the men in black, the electrical disturbances, the sense of purposeful intelligence behind the encounters. Perhaps warnings don't always arrive in forms humans can interpret. Perhaps there are messengers who operate outside human language and human time, attempting communication through the only methods available: visibility, persistence, the creation of patterns that should signal something wrong even if the specifics remain unclear. Perhaps the Mothman was exactly what witnesses described: a harbinger, a prophet, a messenger that appeared because something terrible was approaching, and some intelligence somewhere believed humans should be warned. Or perhaps it was simply coincidence, a series of misidentifications during a period of collective anxiety, followed by inevitable disaster that was unrelated to the sightings, but became forever linked to them through human tendency to find patterns and connections in random events. The answer you accept depends fundamentally on how you understand reality itself, whether you believe it is limited to what current science can measure and explain, or whether you think reality is vast and strange, occasionally intersecting our everyday world in ways that defy explanation, leaving traces and patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose beyond human comprehension. What remains undeniable is the pattern, the sightings, the timing, the prophecies, the disaster, the witnesses who saw something they couldn't explain and carried that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Some warnings don't come with instructions. They arrive only with the chance to listen, to pay attention, to accept that the world might be stranger than we think, that messages might arrive from directions we're not looking, that intelligence might exist in forms we don't recognize, attempting communication in languages we can't speak. The Mothman appeared in Point Pleasant for 13 months, and then vanished when the bridge collapsed. Whether it was trying to warn the town or simply observing an approaching tragedy, whether it existed in flesh and blood or in dimensional spaces we can't access, whether it will ever appear again, these questions remain open. The Ohio River continues flowing. The new bridge carries traffic safely across. The statue stands in the town centre, wings spread, eyes glowing in manufactured red light. Tourists take photos. Researchers debate theories. Skeptics dismiss the entire phenomenon as delusion and fraud. And sometimes, late at night when the town is quiet, people still report seeing something in the darkness. A shape with wings. Eyes that glow red in the shadows. A presence that watches without speaking. The messenger might be gone, but the message remains. Reality is stranger than we think. Warnings come in forms we don't expect. And sometimes, when tragedy approaches, something tries to make itself visible, hoping that someone, somewhere, will understand what it means before it's too late. The Mothman phenomenon ended more than 50 years ago, but the questions it raised remain as urgent and unanswered as they were the morning after the Silver Bridge fell into the Ohio River, taking 46 lives with it, and leaving a small West Virginia town forever marked by 13 months, when the impossible walked among them, and nobody knew what it meant until the moment when knowledge came too late to save anyone.